Chapter 859. It's too small, I can't see it clearly. Lord Wei's eyes are failing him. Of course he can't see it clearly. Let me see. Mars' position is indeed a ball, but where is the heart? Didn't they say that the star of misfortune rushed to the heart? I can't see it. Stop looking, we've been looking for a long time, but we still can't find the heart. To the courtiers, the thing in front of them was really a strange thing. It could see things from afar so clearly, and Mars was hanging in the sky. Who would have thought that the flashing light in the sky that they usually saw at night was actually a ball? Seeing is believing. This was a concept that had existed since ancient times. Most of the people present firmly believed that the eyes could not deceive people. Moreover, a few old generals in the military had just said that the Academy of Sciences had already given the military one of these things. They called it the Eye of the Heavens, and it could even see the head of the enemy from a few miles away. Ambushes and traps were all useless under the Eye of the Heavens. The courtiers trusted the school of mathematics the most. Those who came out of it were all powerful people, and they were talents that the court fought over. As for the Academy of Sciences, they thought that it was something that the crown prince would play with for a few days on a whim, and then abandon. However, no one expected that the thing that the Academy of Sciences came up with would cause a stir in the court several times. There was no need to mention the kite that could send people to the sky, the water wheel that could easily pump water from a low place to a high place, and the farming tools that could greatly simplify the plowing process. All of these things had invisibly changed their knowledge, and even changed the lives of many people. Nowadays, for the farmers, cattle were no longer that important. As long as there was a strong laborer in the family, coupled with the new farming tools, they could completely play the role of the cattle. This was enough to be called a groundbreaking event. His Majesty was so happy that he rewarded 100,000 taels of silver. After such a short period of time, the Academy of Sciences came up with such a magical device, and it was a great eye-opener for everyone. Of course, many people knew that today's event would not be as simple as looking at the stars. The matter of Mars guarding the heart had caused an uproar. Now there was a rumor among the people that Her Royal Highness was the Mars Bane. It was the princess who offended His Majesty. How could the Academy of Sciences not have any ulterior motives for holding a stargazing event at this time that involved a sensitive topic like Mars? Cui Qing's face was somewhat gloomy. He had already guessed the purpose of this stargazing. He glanced vaguely in a certain direction, and the official nodded slightly. The telescope that was used to observe Mars was the one with the highest observation distance and the best quality. However, if it was used to observe the moon, it didn't have such high requirements. Apart from that one, there were a few others of slightly inferior quality, but they were more than enough to watch the moon. Sir, is there really no Chang'e on the moon? The proud Lolita ran over from afar. She had just seen the moon through that strange thing. That bumpy, ugly thing was not the moon she had imagined. The moon in her heart had Chang'e, the jade rabbit, and the beautiful osmanthus tree. The moon palace was not like that. Li Yi shook his head helplessly. The proud Lolita asked pitifully, "Is there no osmanthus tree or the moon palace?" Li Yi could only shake his head. "What about the jade rabbit?" "There should be a jade rabbit." Li Yi still shook his head. The proud Lolita was very sad. She threw herself into Li Yi's arms sadly, and her tears were about to fall. Li Yi stroked her hair. Although it was indeed a little ruthless and cruel to burst a girl's dream, Shanning had grown up. Compared with the cruel world she would recognize in the future, it was nothing at all. Her Royal Highness threw herself into the arms of a man. In the eyes of the other officials around, it was certainly a little unbelievable, but the situation in front of them was a little different. County Marquis Li was the master of Her Royal Highness, so his identity was naturally closer. His Majesty doted on the little princess the most. She was usually simple-minded, and when she was sad, it was inevitable that she would do something beyond the bounds of propriety. However, everyone deliberately ignored this scene. With His Majesty's love for her, even the censors did not dare to step forward to criticize her. The proud Lolita wiped the non-existent tears, secretly glanced at the master, and then secretly glanced at Brother Drunkard, next to him, and generously held the master's hand. He was sad just now, and sad people could have a little preferential treatment. In the field, Li Xian had already taken out a model of the sun and the moon, and was fiddling with it. As for Earth, which was the land they were on, Li Yi did not allow him to tell the people present that the land they were stepping on was actually a ball. It was just that a board with the surname Fong was used to replace it. This was to avoid some unnecessary trouble. We know that the sun and the moon are both in the sky. After the sun sets, the moon rises, but this is not absolute. In fact, we often see the situation of the sun and the moon in the same sky, but because the sun is too strong, we can't notice it. There were 3 people from the Academy of Sciences holding the model of the sun, the moon, and the earth respectively. Li Xian stood at the side and waved his hand. After the 3 people moved their positions, according to the order of the sun, moon, and earth, they formed a straight line. When the moon runs to the middle of the earth and the sun, it will block a part of the sunlight, casting the shadow of the moon on the earth. People who are shrouded by the shadow of the moon can't see the sun that is blocked. This is what we call heavenly dog swallowing the sun. This principle was very easy to understand. In addition, there were 3 people there holding the model to demonstrate, and the 4th person lit a candle to simulate the sunlight. Indeed, a black shadow appeared on the earth. Someone stood on the earth and took a look, and immediately came to a realization. So that's how it is. Li glanced at the official. When Li Xian chose the actors, he was too sloppy. This acting was a little exaggerated. Although it was exaggerated, the principle was still the same. He didn't come up with any new theory. He just used the concept that everyone already had to explain the cause of the solar eclipse in a vivid manner. None of the people present were stupid. If they still couldn't figure it out, they wouldn't be here today. Li Xian waved his hand, and the position of the 3 people changed again. Using the same principle, if the moon runs to the opposite side, and the earth is between the moon and the sun, then the moon will leave the earth's shadow. This is what we call heavenly dog swallowing the moon. The place suddenly became a little quiet. After listening to the Crown Prince's explanation, they were surprised to find that the principle was actually so simple. At the beginning, the Crown Prince had already used a very simple example to tell them that the moon itself couldn't shine. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a full moon and a half moon. Although this was contrary to their previous beliefs, the Crown Prince's reasoning was reasonable. They just needed to think about it for a while to understand it. After that, everything else was natural. Heavenly dog swallowing the sun, heavenly dog swallowing the moon, heavenly dog. Even if they hadn't heard the Crown Prince's explanation, they still didn't believe it. If the sun and moon had already been swallowed by the heavenly dog, could it still spit them out? Wouldn't the heavenly dog find it disgusting to stutter so many times? A bunch of nonsense. This is simply a bunch of nonsense. Just as everyone lowered their heads in contemplation, and the place became quiet, a voice suddenly rang out from the crowd. An old man walked out from the crowd and said loudly, "The book of history says that only when she is at peace, Judo is subverted, Shen is confused by wine, Bianguan is separated, Tianji is disturbed, Xia abandons Juxi. It is the new moon of the autumn season." The old man looked at Li Xian and said indignantly, "Every heavenly dog swallowing the sun means that the Son of Heaven doesn't cultivate virtue, and the heavens are warning. This is?" Li Xian looked at him and asked. The old man said righteously, "I am the imperial astronomer." The book of history says? Li Xian looked at the imperial astronomer, took out 2 pieces of silver, one big and one small, and held them in his fist. He looked at the old man and asked, "Then did the book of history say that if I let go, which of the 2 pieces of silver in my hand will fall first?" Note: the imperial astronomer's superior is called the imperial astronomer. Chapter 860. It was within everyone's expectations that the imperial astronomer would stand up to refute the crown prince. Stargazing, divination, and calendar calculation had always been the duty of the imperial astronomer. The crown prince's words just now were reasonable and his demonstration was vivid. Even those who did not understand astrology would be convinced. However, this was tantamount to smashing the reputation of the imperial astronomer. In other words, it was destroying the faith of those who had devoted their lives to it. However, no one expected that after the imperial astronomer stood up, the crown prince did not refute him. The change was so fast that it was even a little confusing. Moreover, although the imperial astronomer was old, he was not muddle-headed. The difference between the two pieces of silver was so obvious. Surely he could not be mistaken? When it came to the issue of faith, the imperial astronomer could still be neither servile nor overbearing in front of the crown prince. He looked at the crown prince's hands and said, although the imperial annals did not say it, the crown prince should not think that this old man is muddle-headed. If your highness let go at the same time, the heavier silver will naturally fall first. Dong. Li Xian let go of his hands. The two pieces of silver fell to the ground, and also hit the old imperial astronomer's heart. The surrounding officials were also in an uproar. This did not make sense. Could there be a trap? The imperial astronomer did not believe it. He picked up the two pieces of silver, weighed them, and tried them with his own hands. He then took out two pieces of different sizes and tried them again. He murmured, "How could this be? How could this be?" Not far away, Prince Ning smiled and said a few words in Emperor Jing's ear. Emperor Jing was slightly surprised, but a smile also appeared on his face. This child. Zheng Zimo pulled on Li Yi's sleeve and asked curiously, why? Li Yi turned his head and glanced at her. He said, I can't explain it in a short time. When we go home tonight, I will explain it to you slowly. Ahem. Not far behind the two, the capital governor, Lord Zeng, coughed heavily. An official next to him asked doubtfully, Lord Zeng, are you not feeling well? Sung Shichen waved his hand. I caught a cold yesterday. It's fine, it's fine. On the other hand, the imperial astronomer stood rooted to the spot in a daze, forgetting even to pick up the silver tails that had fallen to the ground. When he heard the discussions around him, he finally came back to his senses. Suppressing the shock and confusion in his heart, he immediately said, these two matters cannot be lumped together. This old man was talking about the solar eclipse and the lunar eclipse. What you just said is simply a bunch of nonsense, a bunch of nonsense. Li Xian cupped his hands politely and said, since the imperial astronomer thinks what I just said is nonsense, why don't you point out where I'm wrong? I, Li Xian, am all ears. The officials nodded in agreement at the crown prince's attitude. This was the bearing and demeanor that a member of the royal family should have. Even when he was being criticized, he was still able to maintain such a state of mind. It was truly rare. If even the esteemed crown prince was like this, then the imperial astronomer's attitude immediately put him at a disadvantage. You're wrong. The imperial astronomer opened his mouth, but only managed to utter these few words. He only knew that the crown prince was definitely wrong, and definitely would be wrong, but he simply could not point out where exactly he was wrong. What the crown prince had said just now was so reasonable, and that demonstration was so vivid and clear. How could the imperial astronomer find any mistakes? After opening his mouth a few times, he waved his hand and said loudly, a bunch of nonsense, simply a bunch of nonsense. Li Xian continued to ask politely, since it's nonsense, may I trouble the imperial astronomer to tell me where the nonsense is? In short, a bunch of nonsense. My lord, you're being a little unreasonable. Li Xian was not the only one who thought that the imperial astronomer was being unreasonable. Most of the people present felt the same way. Even if the crown prince was wrong, as long as the imperial astronomer gave a basis, everyone would be able to come to a conclusion. However, it was obvious that the crown prince had always been reasonable and polite. The imperial astronomer only understood the words a load of nonsense. It was obvious that the imperial astronomer was being a little unreasonable. The smile on Li Xian's face had already disappeared. He looked at the old man and said coldly, I'm trying to reason with you. If you continue to be unreasonable, the Academy of Sciences and the Crown Prince's residence will not be so easily bullied. The old man shuddered when he looked at him, but he suddenly laughed maniacally and said, I remember now. You just said that the lunar eclipse was the shadow cast by the Earth on the moon. In that case, the shadow of the Earth on the moon should be extremely square. So why is it curved? The moment these words were spoken, the entire place fell silent once again. Many people thought about it and nodded slightly. The imperial astronomer's words made a lot of sense. If the crown prince could not explain, then his previous judgment was very questionable. A thoughtful expression appeared on Li Xian's face. He nodded and said, "What you said makes sense." A smile appeared on the imperial astronomer's face. "So you admit that you're talking nonsense?" Li Xian thought for a moment, then said, "It's all thanks to the imperial astronomer's reminder. Since the sun is round, the moon is round, and even Mars is round, and all the stars we see with this object are round. Why can't our Earth be round in the same starry sky?" He suddenly clapped his hands and said in sudden realization, "That's right, no wonder the shadow of the Earth on the moon is curved. No wonder we can only see far by climbing high. No wonder the horizon is also curved when standing by the sea. No wonder we always see the mast before the hull of the ship when sailing from the sea. Perhaps the Earth beneath our feet is also a big ball?" The imperial astronomer stood where he was, the crown prince's words echoing in his mind. Then there was a buzz. "Hee, a bunch of nonsense, a bunch of nonsense. Misleading people with lies, this is misleading people with lies. Fiend star, so you're the fiend star, fiend star." Li Xian looked at the crazed imperial astronomer and waved his hand. "Take this lord away to rest." No one cared about the mad imperial astronomer anymore. Their minds were filled with the words that the crown prince had just said. The imperial astronomer's words not only enlightened the crown prince, but also made them think deeply. During an eclipse, the Earth's shadow, the sails of ships sailing from the sea. If the Earth was flat, why would one need to climb high to look far away? The sun, the moon, Mars, why had they never thought about these things? The crown prince was really quick-witted among the crowd. Cui Qing's expression could no longer be described as gloomy. Meanwhile, Li Xian clapped his hands and continued his explanation. "Now that we're done with the solar and lunar eclipses, let's talk about Mars guarding the heart. Just now, everyone saw that there's nothing around Mars. There's not much difference between using Mars to look at Xian Su and using our eyes to look at Xian Su. This is because Xian Su is too far away from us. It's like two objects that are separated from each other. When we look at it from afar, we'll think that they're very close to each other. Xian Su is so far away from us that what we see is 500. Cough. Li Xian turned around and looked at Li Yi with disappointment. Then he turned back and said, "In short, Mars and Xian Su will never meet each other. Therefore, the saying that Mars guards the heart while the jinx rushes to Xian Su is nonsense. Anyone who uses this to slander the royal family has ulterior motives," he sighed and said. "Compared to the vast starry sky, we're so tiny. Who knows that when we look up at the starry sky, what we see is just the passing of the starry sky." Cough. Cough. Li covered his mouth and coughed twice. Beside him, the Luo Shui goddess asked with concern, "What's wrong? Are you not feeling well? Should we go back earlier?" The proud Lolita also looked nervous. Sir isn't feeling well. I'll ask my father to summon the imperial physician." Li grabbed her hand tightly and didn't let her run away. He shook his head and said, "I'm fine. It's just that my throat was a little itchy. I'm fine now." A hint of pain appeared on the proud Lolita's face. She looked up at Li Yi pitifully and whispered, "Sir, you're hurting me." I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Li Yi hurriedly let go of her hand. On the other side, Li Xian had already finished his scientific activity. He pointed to the telescope at the side and said with a smile, "Today's stargazing will end here. If anyone still wants to see the full picture of Mars, please go ahead." As soon as he finished speaking, the crowd surged towards a certain direction. Chapter 861. The Stargazing Conference opened the eyes of all the officials and nobles present. His Royal Highness convinced people with reason, crushed the imperial astronomer unilaterally, and completely overturned the rumors that had been circulating for hundreds of years. This was not the first time that the Academy of Sciences had subverted tradition. Even people could grow wings and fly to the sky, which proved that the heavenly hound that they didn't believe in actually existed. This was also within the range of their psychological tolerance. As for the fact that the ground under their feet was actually a big ball, for a while, some people still found it difficult to accept. But His Royal Highness's arguments were sufficient, and even if they wanted to refute, they didn't know where to start. Just the matter of a heavy object falling to the ground was enough to make them think for a long time. and Terry's guarding the heart was a jinx, and the rumor of His Majesty naturally fell apart. After today, if anyone dared to use this matter to make a fuss, it would mean that they had ulterior motives and intended to slander the eldest princess, who had made great contributions to the country. His Majesty would not easily forgive such bad behavior. The banquet came to an end. Emperor Jing and the Empress got up, and the officials gradually dispersed. Although there were some waves in the middle, today's stargazing conference could be regarded as successful. Li was very glad that he finally came to see. Otherwise, he would have been ruined by Li Xian, who couldn't control his mouth when he was happy. Let's go back to. Li turned his head and said. Zheng Zimo nodded gently. At this time, a female official came around from behind and whispered, Master Li, the eldest princess has been waiting for you outside for a long time. Zheng Zimo looked at him and said, You go first, I will wait for you here. Li shook his head and said, Let's go together. There should be nothing important, so we can go out together. The eldest princess had been accompanying the Empress and Princess Ning today. Li saw her, but he was a little far away and didn't say much. She was going back to the palace at night. When Li walked out of the hall, he saw her waiting in the corridor on the left from a distance. Li walked over, first tilted his head to look at Zheng Zimo, and introduced, This is, I know. Emingzi nodded slightly to her. Miss Zheng. Your Highness. Zheng Zimo bowed to her. No need to be so polite. She shook her head and pointed ahead. It's getting late. Let's talk as we walk. She didn't say anything about the cross-dressing goddess of Luo Shui, nor did she ask anything about it. As a result, Li didn't even have the chance to explain himself. She walked in front, and after a few steps, she looked back at Li and said, You've worked hard for this matter. What are you talking about? Li shook his head. Moreover, the one who's really suffering is Li Xian. If we don't let him say what he wants to say, it must be very uncomfortable. After tonight, the Cui family shouldn't be able to cause any more waves. Are you sure the Cui family is behind this? What else? Li waved his hand and said, Don't worry too much. After this time they have almost no other tricks to play. However, we still need to be on guard. After all, a cornered dog will jump over the wall, and a cornered rabbit will bite. In the next 2 days, there should be some rebound, but you don't have to worry about this. Tonight's stargazing gathering was only to shut the mouths of the discerning people in the court. The most important thing was the ordinary people who didn't know the truth, and were easily incited by evil people. After today, they must strike while the iron is hot and completely reverse the public opinion. Then if you need anything, just tell me. She looked back again and boarded an extremely luxurious carriage. I'm leaving. Li waved to her. Fong and the sloppy old man had returned, and the carriage was parked not far away. The two of them had roasted chicken in one hand and fine wine in the other, leaning against the carriage and chatting enthusiastically against the moon. Li was about to walk over, but Zheng Zimo shook her head and said, Anyway, it's not far. Let's walk back. Li waved to Fong, who was driving the carriage, and the carriage slowed down. It didn't get too close and hung far behind them. Zheng Zimo looked in the direction where the carriage disappeared and murmured, It's really not easy for a woman like the eldest princess to govern such a large country like this. Yes, Li nodded. If she gave birth to a man, she would definitely be emperor material. Zheng Zimo tilted her head and glanced at him. You're the one who doesn't want her to give birth to a man, right? Li thought about it carefully, and felt that he really couldn't accept it. He looked at her again and said, It's fine if she's a man, but it's also a different feeling for a woman to dress up as a man. He reached out and pinched her chin. Come, little brother, give me a smile. A figure walked out of a shop on the side of the street. A smile had just appeared on her face and she was about to greet him, but she quickly retracted her arm halfway. Li looked at Lin Wanru, who had walked out of the shop. Lin Wanru stood on the steps and looked at him. Well, I'll take a look and go back later. She turned around and walked into the boutique again. Goddess Luo Shui blushed. After glaring at him, she quickly ran in. Miss Lin, wait a minute. It's not what you think. When they walked back together, Lin Wanru looked at him apologetically and said, I'm sorry, I just thought. Li shook his head. He couldn't blame her. After all, when Zheng Zima was dressed as a man, she looked like a slightly androgynous young man. Whether it was men or women, she was very attractive. The scene just now appeared in her mind. She turned to look at Li Yi and asked, "You have?" Li Yi knew what she was asking. He nodded and said, "We just need a suitable time to welcome her in." "Then does Sister Lu know?" Li Yi nodded. "No wonder." Lin Wanru nodded, and then asked, "Miss Ruoqing, you should also." Ruoqing. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "There are still 2 more opportunities." Then, no more. Li Yi waved his hand again and again. He didn't see it before. Why was Miss Lin so curious? He immediately changed the topic and said, "It's so late. What are you doing in the shop?" Lin Wanru turned around and said, "Today I investigated some customers who were used to buying ready-made clothes in the shop, and then I helped them with the accounts. There are still a few opportunities." A few steps behind the two, Lin Yong counted with his fingers. When he raised his head, he let out a long sigh. The Cui family. When a maidservant went in to serve tea, she held her breath. After leaving the room, she wiped the cold sweat from her forehead and quickly ran away. In the hall, Cui Qing's face was extremely gloomy. He picked up the tea in front of him and drank it all in one gulp. However, because the tea was too hot, he spat it out again. His face turned red, and he slammed the teacup on the ground. The teacup shattered, and the tea splashed everywhere. Beside him, Cui Qingming asked in disbelief, "That imperial astronomer has really been driven crazy? Is there no one else in the imperial astronomer who has come forward?" Cui Qingze slapped the table and said angrily, "Who would have thought that the thing in the Academy of Sciences could even be seen by Yinghua? That ball is clearly hanging there. Everyone has seen it. How can the imperial astronomer argue with him?" Cui Qingming looked dispirited. "But our arrangements these days. Those old foxes in the court can't be counted on." Cui Qingze waved his hand and said, "While the matter of the stargazing conference hasn't spread, let's add some fuel to the fire. After doing so much, there has to be some splash." Cui Qingming nodded and said, "I'll arrange it right now." After Cui Qingze sat down, he asked again, "Where's Qing Duo? Why didn't I see him last night?" Cui Qingming said, "Qing Duo went out to drink with his friends. The Chu family still needs to be maintained. He has a good relationship with the second son of the Chu family. In the evening he met a few friends, and it seems that he went to the Drunken Moon restaurant." Cui Qingze nodded, and his face looked a little better. Qing Duo is quite sensible to think of this. "All right, you can go back to your work." After Cui Qingming left, Cui Qingze walked out of the room and asked, "What is Madam doing at night?" A maid at the door immediately replied, "Madam said that she was not feeling well, so she went back to her room early to rest." Cui Qingze nodded again, and his heart immediately felt much better. At the same time, in a room somewhere in the Cui residence, a charming woman sat on the bed, looking sullen. Didn't he just drink with someone the day before yesterday? Why did he go again? It's a rare opportunity, and he wasted it. Chapter 862. After New Year's Eve, the bustling scene in the capital city did not diminish, but increased. Before New Year's Eve, the ordinary people in the capital city were busy celebrating the new year. The officials who came from other places did not dare to slack off in the slightest for the first day of the imperial court. After New Year's Eve, they would visit their relatives and friends for a few more days. At the very least, he would leave after the Lantern Festival and tour the capital from top to bottom once. It was no wonder that the foreigners had not seen the world. Today's capital city was changing day by day. It was very different from what they remembered in the past. There were many interesting places, but they could not see enough. In these few days, the big and small shops in the capital city, as well as the peddlers and merchants, made a lot of money. The ready-made clothes and underwear shops were often sold out as soon as the goods were put on display. The brothels were overcrowded every day. If it was only the capital city, the demand for goods would not be so great. Among them, there were many businessmen from other places and even foreign countries. They would transport the goods they bought from the capital city back and resell them to make a profit. This also made Li Yi increasingly feel that he should not stay in the capital city. As long as there was a brothel, the family shops would flourish everywhere. He would not give the black-hearted middlemen a chance to make a profit. Li Yi sat on the bed and carried the little guy who was about to fall back. After 2 months, the little guy became active. He crawled around on the bed and wanted to grab anything he saw. When he cried, his voice became louder. Rui and he were tortured at night. Rui had just coaxed him to sleep in the morning and was forced to the room by Li Yi to rest. After a while, the little guy woke up again. He was full of energy and seemed to be full of energy. Li Yi just sat on the bed and thought about something. The little guy did not know when he fell asleep again. He asked Xiaohuan to come over and look after him. Other than Rui, only Xiaohuan hugged him, and he would not cry no matter how long it took. When he walked out of the door, he happened to see the sloppy old man limping in from the outside. Although Su was older, he was still a guru. The number of people in the world who could hurt him could be counted on one hand. It was even more impossible for him to sprain his ankle while walking. It was because he had made some progress in martial arts recently. It seemed that he had made a small breakthrough in his realm, so he excitedly challenged his second granduncle. After he came out of the courtyard, he became like this. Li Yi looked at him and said, "Su should rest at home today. I'll ask Feng to go out with me." The old man was already in such a state, yet he still wanted to trouble him to accompany him. It would be suspicious if he was abusing the old man. It doesn't matter. The sloppy old man shook his head and said, "The path of martial arts has always been bumpy. This small injury is nothing." Li Yi leaped up and landed steadily on the carriage. The sloppy old man glanced at him and said with some surprise, "You've made some progress recently?" Li Yi lifted the curtain, turned around and said with a smile, "I ate well, slept well, and was in a good mood. I accidentally entered a little." There was never a lack of topics in the capital city. As the people under the feet of the emperor, the people of the capital city had pride and confidence that people in other places did not have. They cared about the state affairs, the gossip of the officials and nobles in the capital city, whether the soldiers on the front line had enough to eat, and they were also curious about how the third master of the Cui family was better than the first master of the Cui family. Especially for some people who had a strong sense of national pride. Although they were just ordinary people, they cared about the country no less than the officials in the court. However, it was also because they were only ordinary people who could not participate in the state affairs that some news could not be obtained. Therefore, the brothel became the favorite place for these people. In the past 2 days, the contents of the stargazing meeting that had been widely spread were what people were most interested in. On the stage, an old storyteller was describing with great emotion how His Highness had wittily dealt with the imperial astronomer that night, and how the wronged imperial astronomer had pestered him endlessly. Below the stage, many people were intoxicated by the story, and there were also people who lowered their heads and discussed in whispers. A young man said in surprise, "What? 2 pieces of silver with a huge difference in weight fell from the same height and fell to the ground at the same time. Shouldn't the heavier one fall first? This is too unimaginable." A young man beside him smiled and said, "If this brother doesn't believe it, you can take out 2 pieces of silver and try it. You will immediately know whether what he said is true or false." "Brother, what you said is reasonable." The young man nodded and took out an ingot of silver and a silver fragment from his waist. He stood up, raised them to the same height, and let go at the same time. The 2 pieces of silver fell too fast, and he could not see which one fell first. But this was far from what he had imagined, that the silver ingot should fall earlier than the silver fragment. An expression of disbelief appeared on his face. "It's actually true." The young man beside him picked up the 2 pieces of silver on the ground and put them in his bosom. He said, "Although it's a little unimaginable, seeing is believing. We have always been wrong." "Yes, I didn't expect that we would be wrong for so many years when we could easily verify the truth." The young man nodded and sighed inwardly. He then looked at him with a frown. "That's my silver." "What, yours?" "I clearly picked it up." In another restaurant, a green-robed scholar was talking loudly, attracting the attention of the onlookers in the restaurant. "What stargazing meeting?" They actually said that the earth under our feet is a big ball. This is ridiculous, a bunch of nonsense. The green-robed scholar spoke passionately. He drank a cup of wine and said again, "The heavenly dog swallows the sun, and the heavenly dog swallows the moon. The sages have long explained this. Could it be that we scholars have been reading the sages' books all along have been wrong? Since ancient times, there has never been a woman in charge of the government. She abandoned the moral principles and ignored them. That's why there are bewilderment guarding the heart and warning the celestial phenomena. Now, someone actually wants to use such a twisted theory to cover up the past. What is his motive? What is his motive? If Her Majesty insists on doing this, the country will fall. The country will fall. We scholars." In the restaurant, some people listened excitedly, some people looked thoughtful, and some people's eyes flashed with suspicion. Fong drank a mouthful of wine and said angrily, "Young master, this guy is full of nonsense. Why don't you arrest him and put him in prison?" Li Yi shook his head and did not speak. The sloppy old man tore a chicken leg and said lightly, "The Jing kingdom does not convict people based on words. The emperor is muddle-headed, and the officials and the people can be scolded. These scholars are the most united. If you arrest one of them, countless more will appear. In this way, the world will be in chaos." Fong slapped the table and said, "Is there no way to deal with him?" As soon as he finished speaking, there was a noise at the door. "Hey, where did the beggar come from? You can't go in here. I want to find my husband. My husband is inside." "What do you mean by your husband? Go, go, go. I'll give you a bun. Go quickly. My husband will be the top scholar in the future. I want to see him." "Top scholar?" The waiter was slightly stunned when he heard the ragged woman's words. The woman took this opportunity to break in. She quickly walked to the green-robed scholar, grabbed his sleeve, and said excitedly, "Husband, I finally found you." She pulled out a 5 or 6-year-old girl behind her and quickly said, "Young man, hurry up and greet Daddy." Chapter 863. The little girl raised her head and looked at the young man. She blinked her big watery eyes and said timidly, "Daddy." The scholar in cyan shirt was talking with his saliva flying everywhere. He had already thought that after this matter, he would probably have a way to become an official. He was stunned by the sudden scene in front of him. When he came to his senses, he saw the ragged woman pulling his sleeve. He immediately waved his hand in disgust and said angrily, "You must have mistaken me for someone else. Who is your husband?" The woman pushed the messy hair off her forehead and said hurriedly, "Husband, don't you know me? I'm Yang." The young scholar's face changed. Was it really a love affair that he had gotten into on his way to school? But he couldn't remember when he had a love affair with this woman named Yang. Now he had a family, and his wife's family had some power in the capital city. Usually he relied on his father-in-law to help him. Even if he really had a love affair with her, he couldn't admit it at this time. He suddenly shook his sleeve and said loudly, "I don't know you. You must have mistaken me for someone else." The woman was stunned and looked at him in a daze. The excitement on her face gradually disappeared, and her face turned gray. "In order to find you, I took young man on the road for a year. When we finally arrived at the capital city, young man was seriously ill. If it weren't for a kind-hearted person, she would have. She said in a desolate voice, "I know you. You already have a family in the capital city. I won't disturb you anymore. I will raise young man alone." The little girl looked up at the young scholar with tears in her big eyes. "Mother, father doesn't want us anymore." The woman wiped away her tears and said, "Young man, I mistook you for someone else. Let's go. I'll take you to find your real father." After saying that, she took the little girl's hand and left without looking back. In the restaurant, the young scholar stood there in a daze. Looking at the disgust in the eyes of the people around him, he opened his mouth, but in the end he didn't say anything and left gloomily. "He looks like a dog, but I didn't expect him to be such a cruel and unscrupulous person. She's just like Chun Shimmy from the drama. I thought that story only existed in dramas. I didn't expect." Abandoning his wife and son, yet he is still a scholar. Does he deserve to be called a scholar? He only knows how to read the book of the sage. Is that all the sage taught him? That woman is so pitiful. Her words just now clearly showed that she had already given up all hope. It's really a pity for this mother and son. After the azure-robed scholar left, the people in the restaurant became filled with righteous indignation. In their hearts, the words of a scholar still carried some weight. These people read the book of the sage and preached great principles. However, what principles could a beast in human attire, who could even abandon his wife and son, say? One of them shook his head and said, "Her Royal Highness has never paid attention to such slander. Her Royal Highness only cares about the people of our Jing country. These days, how many new laws have been implemented, how many people can afford to eat, and how many people can afford to study. They don't even think about how much their wives and children have received from Her Royal Highness. These people are cruel and unscrupulous, unscrupulous and unscrupulous." Another person said indignantly, "If this is a jinx, then I hope that there will be more jinxes like this in our Jing nation." In the restaurant, many people revealed ashamed expressions. Just now, when they heard that heartless and unscrupulous person speak so eloquently, they almost believed him. Among them, how many of them had benefited from Her Highness? Not only did they not repay her kindness, but they even helped some people with ulterior motives to slander her. This was ungrateful. Bah! Fong spat out a chicken bone and scolded, "Scum!" Then, a puzzled expression appeared on his face and he asked, "Son-in-law, do you feel that the woman just now is a little familiar?" "Not very familiar." Li nodded, stood up and said, "Let's go and have a look at other places." At the entrance of a tea house, the waiter stopped Li and the other two people and said with a smile, "Sir, this place is booked by someone today." Casually catching an ingot of silver that Fong threw over, the waiter immediately smiled brightly and said, "Sir, please come in." There were many figures in the tea house. Most of them were young people dressed like scholars. They were probably holding a poetry meeting or something like that. Some were writing, while others were commenting loudly. Now that the emperor is ill, the Eastern Palace is empty, and women are in power, the rules are in chaos. The weather is warning us, but the court is ignoring it. I really don't know where the future of our Jing kingdom lies. Someone in the tea house frowned. Today everyone was making friends through literature. Although the young people were full of ambition, it was inevitable that they would discuss the affairs of the country. However, the matter of Yinghua guarding his heart had already been concluded. The imperial astronomer had made disrespectful remarks about Her Highness the Princess, and intended to bring chaos to the court. He had already taken the blame and resigned. Almost all the officials in the court had seen Yinghua with their own eyes. What was the intention of this scholar with the surname Wang to make such remarks at this time? The people of my generation who study. The scholar with the surname Wang had only just started his sentence when he was interrupted by a voice. A plump woman with heavy makeup barged in from outside. Behind her were a few sturdy men. She scolded, "Bull**T scholars. Don't you scholars have to pay when you visit prostitutes?" The scholar with the surname Wang's expression changed. He quickly walked forward and whispered, "Didn't I say that in 2 days?" "Bah!" The old brothel keeper waved her hand and said angrily, "It's only right and proper to pay when visiting prostitutes. It's not easy for us to open our doors to do business. If you don't pay today, I'll drag you to see the officials." The scholar with the surname Wang couldn't care less about the current situation. He quickly said in a low voice, 2 days, just 2 days. You don't have money?" The old brothel keeper glanced at him and waved her hand. "Take him to see the officials." The few sturdy men behind her immediately rushed forward. The scholar with the surname Wang was quickly taken away, leaving the people in the tea house looking at each other in dismay. Scholars had been dissolute since ancient times. Visiting a brothel was nothing much. It could even be considered an elegant thing. However, visiting a brothel without paying was a bit too much. This kind of immoral person, tsk. It was not worth associating with. Li took a sip of tea. The tricks played by the Cui family were too obvious and too straightforward. There was no technical content at all. However, in terms of effectiveness, if the power of the brothel was not involved, there would really be some trouble. These scholars had always been the most provocative group. Their influence could not be underestimated. Fortunately, that Grand Tutor Chu did not collude with the Cui family this time. Otherwise, the matter would have become much more troublesome. When he came out of the tea house and was about to go to the brothel, he once again saw the young scholar he had met in the restaurant. He sat paralyzed in front of a tall mansion door and cried, "Wife, believe me, I really don't know them. This is a false accusation, a false accusation." A servant girl threw out a bag from inside and said in disgust, "Miss said to get lost far away. The next time I see you in the capital, I'll get someone to break your legs." After saying this, the mansion door closed with a bang. "Serves you right." Fong spat fiercely at the young man who had lost his soul. Those who are loyal are always those who butcher dogs, but those who are heartless are always those who are scholars. Li shook his head and sighed. Soon he walked to a brothel. A young girl who was biting on a tonghulu ran out and said happily, "Big brother, you're here." Li patted her head and said with a smile, "Young man, did you listen to Sister watching today?" The young girl nodded vigorously. Young man has always been very obedient. She even performed on stage yesterday. Chapter 864. Fuma, take a closer look. It says that Qin Xianglian is 32 years old and is suing the emperor's son-in-law, deceiving the king, deceiving the emperor, breaking off the marriage, killing his wife and son, losing his conscience. On the stage, an old man was singing passionately, and the audience was listening attentively. This was a new play that had been released not long ago. It was called The Case of the Beautiful Guillotine. It was about a heartless scholar who became the Zhuangyuan and was recruited as the prince consort. He abandoned his first wife and for the sake of riches and fortune, he wanted to kill his wife and son. As soon as this play was released, it became very popular in the capital. The fictional character of Justice Bao was no stranger to them. This story of how he didn't fear power and justice for the people and killed the wicked was very satisfying. It was exactly the kind of play that ordinary people living at the bottom of society like to watch. At this critical juncture, if there really was a heartless person who abandoned his wife and son for the sake of wealth and honor, he would probably be stabbed in half by the audience. In the private room upstairs, Miss Sung wiped away her tears and looked at Li Yi with some bitterness. "Why did you come up with this play?" Needless to say, she, who was overflowing with sympathy, naturally sympathized with Qin Xianglian and her son. One rewatching was used to such scenes. She had seen this play countless times, from the script to the arrangement to the introduction of the stage. Naturally, she would not be touched at this time. She smiled and said, "This is just a play. If it wasn't so complicated and bizarre to stir people's emotions, not many customers would be willing to watch it." Zheng Zimo looked at her and curled her lips. "You only know how to speak up for him." Wan Ruoqing could only shake her head and smile. Li Yi looked at the goddess of Luo Shui and defended himself. Art comes from life, but it is higher than life. Although it is a play, it also reflects the reality of society. Today when I was eating in the restaurant, I saw a real-life Chen Shimi. "You are too naive and don't understand the ugliness of this world." He thought of something and said, "Oh right, if you have the chance, help me thank the madam of the Jade Courtyard. If it wasn't for her this time, there might have been some trouble. She has never been someone who likes to suffer losses." Zheng Zimo shook her head and said, "I came here this morning to talk about the conditions. The new styles of the lingerie workshop will be supplied to them first." These were all unimportant matters. After the failure of the imperial astronomer, the Cui clan was still too naive to think that they could use these scholars to stir up the storm. They were but a plate of loose sand, and their usefulness was very limited. He just didn't know what kind of tricks they would use next time after they failed again. It wasn't that they hadn't considered solving the problem once and for all. However, how could a family that had existed for hundreds of years in the Jing kingdom fall so easily? At the very least, he needed a heavy primer. "Trash, all of you are trash." In a hall of the Cui clan, a row of young scholars knelt down. The head of the Cui clan, Cui Qingze, could no longer suppress the anger in his heart. His expression was ferocious, and he roared incessantly. The people kneeling in the hall lowered their heads, not even daring to breathe loudly. All the arrangements he had made, without exception, had failed. They didn't even stir up the slightest ripple. On the contrary, because of these things, the public opinion of the people had been completely reversed. In this invisible confrontation, the Chui clan had once again suffered a crushing defeat. Standing to the side, Chui Qingming looked at the trembling people, waved his hand and said, "All of you leave." As if they had been granted amnesty, they hurriedly got up from the ground and disappeared from the hall in an instant. Chui Qing's whole body slumped on the chair. His eyes were lifeless, and his expression was dispirited. "Big brother." Chui Qingming had just opened his mouth when he was interrupted. Chui Qing's stared blankly ahead and murmured, "Qingming, do you think we're getting further and further away from that path?" Chui Qingming clenched his fists and said through gritted teeth, "Her Highness is still here, and His Highness is still here. We haven't lost, and the Chui clan hasn't lost. We lost miserably yesterday. Chu Ping, you're the only one who won the most. No matter what, you have to pay for today's match, right?" In the Miaoyin pavilion, a young man put his arm around another young man's shoulder and said with a smile, "Of course." Chu Ping nodded and then said in a low voice, "However, you mustn't let my grandfather know that we went to the gambling house." Chui Shixin patted him on the chest and said, "Of course we know that. Don't worry, if the Grand Tutor finds out, won't we also be punished?" Only then did Chu Ping relax. He touched the banknotes in his bosom and felt a burst of joy in his heart. The Chu family had a strict upbringing. Although he was the eldest son of the first wife, because of this, the elders were even stricter with him. Previously, he had traveled with his grandfather to broaden his horizons. Now that he had returned to the capital and was accompanied by his friends, he finally realized that there were so many fun things in this world. Come, let's go in first." Chui Shixin waved his hand and pointed at Qingyu, who was at the side. As he walked, he said, "I heard from Junliang that you also like that kind of thing, Chu Ping. You can talk more with little Duke Qin about this. I believe you will learn a lot from him." Chu Ping's face reddened and he hurriedly said, "Let's go in and talk." A well-rounded woman came out from inside and smiled. "Oh, my young masters, you came at such a good time today. Lady Shuang is preparing to perform in the heavenly room upstairs." Chu Ping asked in confusion, "Lady Shuang?" Chui Shixin smiled and explained, "Lady Shuang's zither skills are the best in the wonderful sound pavilion. If you go up and listen, you'll know. You have a deep understanding of the zither. Perhaps you can even compare notes with Lady Shuang. The wonderful sound pavilion was one of the more famous music halls in the capital. Normally, there was an endless stream of customers. The group went up to the second floor. Under the guidance of the beautiful woman, they entered the heavenly room. The room was very spacious and there were many small rooms inside. There were bead curtains hanging from the outside, forming a ring around the stage in the middle. At this time, there was already a woman on the stage. She was about 16 or 17 years old, and was very charming and lovely. However, her face was a bit pale. At first glance, she gave off a feeling of weakness. Whenever a man saw her appearance, he couldn't help but want to take her into his arms and take good care of her. Chui Shixin stretched out his hand and waved it in front of Chu Ping's eyes. He smiled and said, "Hey, what are you looking at? You're staring straight." "No, nothing." Chu Ping's face reddened, and he lowered his head in a panic. "Could it be that this Lady Shuang is your type?" Chui Shixin looked at him in astonishment and said, "Last time Junliang told me, I didn't believe it. So it turns out that you really do like this sickly appearance. But..." He shook his head with a bit of pity. "But what?" Chu Ping immediately raised his head. "This Lady Shuang is a good woman. It is said that her family isn't very well off and her body is also very weak. She only occasionally plays a song here. I'm afraid you'll be disappointed this time." Chui Shixin's words contained a bit of regret that was difficult to conceal. Although the wonderful sound pavilion was a music hall, it was also a business of secret prostitution. Of course, this place was naturally of a much higher class than the brothels outside. There were also simple musicians, and this Lady Shuang was one of them. His tone changed and he said again, "A fair and graceful lady is a gentleman's desire. If you, Chu Ping, really like her, then boldly pursue her. With the Chu family's noble status, it is not impossible for you to obtain Lady Shuangshuang's heart. At this moment, the sound of the zither rang out. Chu Ping closed his eyes and listened attentively for a while. Then he opened his eyes and said in admiration, Lady Shuangshuang's zither skills can already be considered a master. Cui Shixin patted his shoulder and said, Don't be sad. In a moment, I'll arrange another one for you. Isn't she just the sickly type? As long as you have money, you can find anything. However, don't even think about the one who let us in just now. That's young Duke Qin's. Chu Ping looked at the beautiful woman from just now and immediately shook his head. He sighed in his heart. This young Duke Qin's preferences were truly unique. Chapter 865. Inside the heaven room, the music of the zither was pleasing to the ears. Aside from this music, there was no other noise. After all, those who could come here to listen to music were at least semi-refined people. They wouldn't do something like burning the zither and cooking the crane. Cui Shixin saw Chu Ping staring at the zither-playing woman in a daze. He smiled and whispered, If you really like it, how about tonight? Chu Ping repeatedly shook his head and said, No, this absolutely cannot be done. You must not. Cui Shixin waved his hand and said, I was just saying. Don't worry. How could we dare to help you do such a thing? If the Grand Tutor were to find out, it would be terrible. What kind of people are you talking about? Don't think that I don't know what kind of place your wonderful sound pavilion is. An abrupt voice suddenly sounded from one of the compartments. The beautiful woman from before was pushed out from the inside. She said with a troubled expression, Customer, we cannot agree to your request. Slap. A middle-aged man swayed out from inside and slapped the beautiful woman's face. He scolded, You're a whore and you still want to maintain a chastity? Don't be so shameless. A man pulled the middle-aged man and said, Fifth Lord, you've drunk too much. Let's go back. I didn't drink too much. The middle-aged man waved his hand and pointed at the delicate woman on the stage. He said that, Lady Shuangshuang, come down and drink a cup of wine with Fifth Lord. Fifth Lord is in a good mood today. If you make Fifth Lord happy, you will be heavily rewarded. The woman stood up from the stage and ran to the beautiful woman's side in a panic. She helped her up and asked with concern, Anton, are you all right? I'm fine. The beautiful woman covered her face, but she still smiled at the middle-aged man and said, Guest, Shuangshuang is truly a pure woman. If you like her, I can find another. The middle-aged man slapped her again and drunkenly said, I'm giving you face, but you don't want it. The woman quickly pushed the beautiful woman behind her and said in panic, I'll drink with you. The middle-aged man revealed a smile and reached out to touch her small face. That's more obedient. The woman didn't expect him to be so touchy. She subconsciously dodged and whispered, You please behave yourself. The middle-aged man's face instantly darkened. He slapped her face again and said angrily, You refuse a toast only to drink a forfeit. Do you know who I am? The young girl's body was thin and weak to begin with. After receiving such a heavy slap, she staggered and almost fell to the ground. When she raised her head, her eyes were filled with tears, and there was a trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. From the surrounding cubicles, figures started to walk out one after another. Usually, the majority of those who had such an interest were naturally young people. Moreover, they were young and full of vigor. When they saw injustice, they would always stand up and speak out. Immediately, many people had resentful expressions on their faces as they walked over. A figure was the fastest. After running over, he first helped the woman up and asked with concern, Miss, are you all right? The woman looked at him and nodded gratefully. Thank you, young master, I'm fine. And who are you? The middle-aged man seemed to be angered by the scene in front of him. He reached out to pull the young man's shoulder, but his wrist was caught midway. Scram. Qin Yu suddenly swung his hand and looked at the middle-aged man in front of him. The middle-aged man staggered and looked at the young man in front of him. His expression suddenly changed, and he seemed to have sobered up. He blurted out, Why are you here? Qin Yu didn't even look at him and said lightly, I'll count to 3. If you don't scram, I'll get someone to help you. The middle-aged man's expression changed again and he said in a low voice, "This is outside. You should at least give me some face and leave some face for the Qin family. 3. I'm your fifth uncle. 2. You don't even care about the Qin family's face? 1. The middle-aged man didn't move, but the big man behind him suddenly carried him and quickly ran to the stairs. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared in front of everyone. Chu Ping looked at Qin Yu in disbelief and murmured, "This? Boring." Qin Yu waved his hand and said, "You guys have fun, I'll leave first." Chu Ping was stunned for a moment, then he looked at the woman and asked with concern, "Are you okay?" The delicate woman bowed to him and said gratefully, "Thank you for saving me just now, young master. I can't thank you enough." Chu Ping looked at her face and hurriedly said, "You're bleeding, quickly go and apply some medicine." The beautiful woman squeezed out a smile and said, "Thank you for today's matter, young masters. Please sit here for a while. I'll let Shuang come out later to properly thank you, young masters." The song just now was not finished. After such a thing happened, the beautiful woman quickly arranged for a musician to replace it. However, the people who had already sat back in their rooms didn't have much mood to enjoy it. In a compartment somewhere, someone said in surprise, "The one who used alcohol to act crazy was the Qin family's fifth master?" A person nodded and said, "He just called himself young Duke Qin's fifth uncle. It should be true." That person was puzzled. Then why did Qin fifth master treat him? The person who just answered looked at him in surprise and asked, "You don't know?" That person was even more puzzled. "What do I know?" After a while, after listening to his companion next to him explain what had happened, he opened his eyes wide and said in disbelief, "No way, after doing such an immoral thing, he can actually act like this." Someone who knew the situation shook his head and said, "This matter caused a great stir in the capital city. Even the Qin family couldn't suppress it. Later, it should be the Cui family and His Highness King of Shu who helped to suppress the matter with great difficulty. In that case, this Qin family's fifth master can be considered a pitiful person." That person showed a look of pity and said, "This is simply a great shame. He must hate the Qin family, the Cui family, and His Highness King of Shu to death. What's the use of hating him? What can he do? Among these people, who can he afford to offend?" Someone sighed and said, "It is also because of this matter that this Qin family's fifth master only knows how to drink and have fun all day, drowning his sorrows in alcohol. At first he went to the brothel every day, but recently, he seems to like going to the brothel to watch the shows. After suffering such a great shame, he can still appear in front of everyone openly. He can be considered an anomaly." The one who just stood up seems to be the young master of the Chu family, as expected of someone taught by old Chu. In another room, Chu Ping asked worriedly, "Qin Yu, he treated his elders like this. Is he okay?" Cui Shixin waved his hand and said, "This is nothing. He has done things 10 times or even 100 times worse than this. You don't have to worry." He looked at Chu Ping with a smile and said, "How does it feel to be a hero saving the beauty?" Chu Ping showed an embarrassed expression. At the door, Lady Shuang, who had changed her clothes, had already lifted the curtain and slowly walked in. She bowed to the few people and said softly, "This little girl thanks the few young masters for saving me just now." Cui Shixin pushed Chu Ping, who was stunned, in place and said with a smile, "What are you waiting for? Help the lady up. Put me down." In a certain alley, a middle-aged man patted the shoulder of a big man who was running wildly and said indifferently. The big man panted and said, "Fifth master, a wise man does not fight when the odds are against him. A gentleman's revenge is never too late. Put me down." "Oh." The big man stopped and put down the middle-aged man he was carrying on his shoulder. The middle-aged man looked at him and asked, "Am I a joke?" The big man was startled and suddenly shook his head. "Fifth master, you must be joking. Who dares to say that you are a joke? Hit me." "Ah." The big man's eyes widened. "Hurry up, hit me." The middle-aged man looked at him and said expressionlessly, "Just like what I did to the lady just now." The big man reached out and touched the middle-aged man's forehead and said with some worry, "Fifth master, how about I take you to see a doctor? Do as I say, or I will deduct 1 month's salary. Slap. The big man swung his arm and slapped the middle-aged man's face. The middle-aged man staggered and stood up with the help of the wall. He looked at the big man with a sullen face and asked, "Did I hit you that hard just now?" "Very hard?" The big man scratched his head and said with an apologetic smile, "I'm sorry, Fifth Master. How about we try again?" Chapter 866. The period from the Spring Festival to the Lantern Festival was the busiest time of the year for the brothel. Li sat in front of the window of the small building, writing the latest plays. The reason why the brothel could be so popular was because of the endless wonderful stories and the essence of the culture of the Wuxia people for thousands of years in his mind. Obviously, the old-fashioned scripts from the brothel could not meet the needs of the people. Wan Ruoqing pushed the door open and came in with a food box in her hand. She said softly, "I've been busy all morning. I cooked some porridge. Have some." "It's okay. Put it there. I'll eat it after I finish writing this part." Li raised his head and said, but his stomach was growling. He hadn't eaten anything since morning, so he was really hungry. However, there was not much left to write. He didn't want to be interrupted in the middle, which would be troublesome. Wan Ruoqing came over with the food box, took out the bowl of porridge, and sat beside him. She said, "Eat some first. The script is not urgent." Li didn't say anything this time. He picked up the spoon with one hand, and the other hand was not idle. He drank a mouthful of porridge, wrote a line of words, and then drank another mouthful. He was thinking about whether it was suitable to use a certain plot here. The spoon in his left hand gradually stopped in the air. Then a soft hand took the spoon from his hand and brought the spoonful of porridge to his mouth. Wan Ruoqing smiled and said, "You can't do two things at once. Let me do it." Li smiled awkwardly and said, I'm sorry. Only a hedonistic young master from a wealthy family could enjoy such treatment. It was too extravagant and depraved." In order to express his uneasiness and apology, Li decided to write another 20% discount. Only then would he be able to gain some peace of mind. Li swallowed the porridge she fed him and asked casually, "How are the children recently?" "These days, they are learning something from the old people in the brothel." Wan Ruoqing nodded and said, "It's not a good idea to keep doing cleaning work. Learn more, and you can support yourself in the future. It's up to them whether to stay in the brothel or choose other jobs." Li felt that this was a good idea. Although they were all children, there were still some very talented ones among them. They grew up in the brothel, so their feelings for this place were naturally extraordinary. If they were trained well, they might be entrusted with important tasks in the future. Then they talked about the brothel. Although the script couldn't be finished, the porridge would eventually be finished. When Ruoqing put down the bowl, there was no point in continuing. He stood up, stretched his body and said, "Let's go for a walk." Wan Ruoqing nodded slightly. Even though there were many things to do in the brothel before the Lantern Festival, what could be better than two people walking together? Of course, Li knew that even if it was just the two of them walking together, she would be happy for the whole day. But he didn't know that as soon as he walked downstairs, he met someone he didn't want to meet now, especially at this time. The new capital governor, Lord Zeng, was dressed in casual clothes and didn't have any attendants around him. In the brothel where people came and went, it was easy to be lost in the crowd. Sung Shichen stood opposite, looked at him and said, "Drunk Ink said you were here." Of course, Drunk Ink knew that he was here. He came from Willow Lane. Li looked at him and asked tentatively, "What's the matter?" "What's the matter?" meant that if you have something to say it quickly or leave quickly. "Didn't you see that I have important things to do here? Don't you know that it's not appropriate for you to appear now? Can't you change the time?" Obviously, Lord Zeng didn't understand what he meant. He said, "This is not the place to talk." Wan Ruoqing showed a slight smile on her face and said, "Lord, come in and talk." Li shook his head and walked into the small building again. Sung Shichen picked up the teacup on the table and took a sip before saying, "I've already ordered people to renovate that house. Too much time has passed, and it can't be exactly the same as it was 10 years ago, but it should be 70 to 80% similar." Drunking's birthday is in April, so time is tight. Li nodded and said, a few days ago, Louis found some suspicious points in the files of the Ministry of Justice. However, it was a case from 13 years ago after all. It has been a long time, and the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue died on the way to exile. There are many clues that are hard to verify. However, this is not a difficult matter for him. He should be able to make it in time. Sung Shichen looked up at him and asked, a few days ago, there were rumors about the eldest princess among the people. You should know who did it, right? Li shook his head and said, summoning the king of Shu back to the capital to replace the eldest princess in governing the country. Naturally, it will be whoever benefits the most. Cui Qingze, the head of the Cui family, has fallen ill. Sung Shichen put down the teacup and said, now the head of the Cui family is the second son of the Cui family, Cui Qingming. This person is more difficult to deal with than Cui Qingze. He has always been ruthless and will do anything, even disregarding the consequences. You should be careful. He looked at Li Yi and said, don't think that the Cui family only has this little ability. This time, the crown prince has disbanded the imperial astronomer, and the Cui family's rumor campaign has also been stalled among the people. Although I don't know what you are thinking, I think you don't want the king of Shu to return to the capital and replace the eldest princess in governing the country. Not to mention other things, if Grand Tutor Chu takes the lead this time, it will not be so easy to solve this matter. Grand Tutor Chu will stand up for the Cui family. Li actually had a good impression of this Grand Tutor Chu. The old man did not seem to be as pedantic as he imagined, and this time he did not stand with the Cui family to make things difficult. If it was really as Sung Shichen said, then the matter would really become troublesome. Sung Shichen shook his head and said, according to the Grand Tutor's temperament, he won't. His tone changed and he said, I'm afraid. Afraid of what? Sung Shichen shook his head again and said, I think I'm overthinking. In short, the Cui family will not let this matter go easily. You must be careful. Li nodded and said, I know. In his heart, he had never underestimated the Cui family. Some extreme measures were not to be used until the last moment. It was better to take things step by step. After that, Sung Shichen only cared about drinking tea and did not say anything else. Li Yi suppressed some of his thoughts and thought about the walk with Ruoqing. Seeing that Lord Sung did not seem to have any intention of leaving, he asked tentatively, Lord Sung, would you like to stay and have a meal? Generally speaking, when visiting someone's house at the last minute and hearing the host's invitation to stay, one should decline and stand up to say goodbye. This was an invisible tacit understanding between people. However, as soon as the words left his mouth, he regretted it, because historical experience showed that he and Lord Sung did not have this kind of tacit understanding. As expected, Sung Shichen put down his teacup and raised his head. Okay. After the family banquet, when Chu Ping was helping Grand Tutor Chu back to their room, he suddenly asked, Grandfather, when will the next time we go out? I'm old and can't walk anymore, Grand Tutor Chu said, then raised his eyes to look at him and asked, what, you don't like the capital and want to go out? No, Chu Ping repeatedly shook his head. Although the outside world is more knowledgeable, the capital also has its advantages. Grand Tutor Chu nodded and said, these years outside, you've already seen many things. What you need now is to calm your heart and settle down. Don't follow those people outside and fool around. I know. Chu Ping repeatedly nodded and said, I'm not fooling around. It's just that my zither skills have improved recently, and I often go to the music hall to listen to music. All right. After returning to their room, Grand Tutor Chu waved his hand and said, the Lantern Festival is approaching. You can relax a little. You can go. Chu Ping helped Grand Tutor Chu to his bed and said, Grandfather, rest well. I'll take my leave. Miaoyin Pavilion, Lady Shuang. In the Cui family, Cui Qingming stood in front of the door and looked into the distance. Chapter 867. Yes, father, Chu Ping is very interested in that Lady Shuang. Cui Shixin said, then shook his head and said, however, that Lady Shuang is different from those prostitutes. She has a clean background. It seems that she only has gratitude for Chu Ping and has no ambiguous intentions. Clean background? Cui Qingming smiled somewhat mockingly and said, I've seen many clean girls. Where did you see so many clean girls? A voice suddenly sounded from the side. Cui Qingming turned around and said in surprise, Madam, how did you? The beautiful woman's face was cold and she asked, Tell me, where did you see them? Cui Qingming hemmed and hawed, This matter. Come in. The beautiful woman reached out and dragged him into the room, and the door was slammed shut. Cui Shixin stood at the door, shook his head, and retreated into the courtyard. After the time it took to drink a cup of tea, the door was pushed open again. Cui Qingming walked out of the room, straightened his clothes and said, Today go and meet that lady Shuang in secret. In this world, there is no such thing as a girl with a clean background. As long as you promise her benefits, there will always be a condition for her to give up her innocence. A trace of doubt appeared on Cui Shixin's face. Father, you mean? Cui Qingming whispered a few words, and Cui Shixin showed a look of understanding. He nodded and said, I understand. There are 2 more days to go to the Upper Yuan dynasty. Be careful, don't overreach yourself. Cui Qingming warned him again, then walked out of the courtyard and ordered a servant standing outside. Prepare the carriage, go to the capital governor's mansion. The Upper Yuan dynasty of your Jing kingdom is really lively. Even though she had already experienced the prosperity of the capital, the scene of the Upper Yuan dynasty still made Lin Wanru marvel. The crowded streets, the lanterns that could be seen everywhere, the acrobatic performances on the streets, the fireworks that bloomed in the night sky, and the delicacies that lined both sides of the streets. She had spent several times in the capital of Qi, but what she had seen and heard back then could not be compared to what she was seeing here. If they had not seen it with their own eyes, none of the people from the Qi kingdom would have believed that the Jing kingdom, which they had always regarded as their weak neighbor, had far surpassed them in some aspects. Rui tilted her head to look at her and said with a smile, If Sister Lin likes the capital, you can stay here for a few more days. The 2 girls in front were talking while Li Yi held on to Yong Ning and the proud Loli's hands to prevent them from getting lost in the crowd. Although there were countless palace guards and experts from the Lu Alliance in the crowd, he still had to be prepared. He didn't bring the little fellow out today, so he didn't sleep for the whole day. According to his usual practice, he would sleep until tomorrow morning. Passing by a Tonghulu stall, Li Yi bought a few skewers of assorted Tonghulu, gave one each to Xiao Huan. Yong Ning and proud Lolita turned his head to look at Mississippi Lu, asked, Want one? Childish. Mississippi Lu glanced at him, expressed her disdain, and picked a bunch of grapes. There were not many opportunities for a family to come out together like this, especially when it was such a lively occasion. It only happened 3 or 4 times a year. Just as he told them to be careful when eating the candied hawthorn, and not to hurt themselves, an extremely rough voice came from behind. Get out of the way, get out of the way. The capital Yamen is arresting a criminal of the imperial court. Get out of the way, all of you get out of the way. Several constables in Yamen uniform rushed over from behind. Their movements were extremely rough, and many people were pushed down by them, but they could only curse their bad luck and didn't dare to show it. A man who looked like a constable was pressed down on his shoulder before he could push Li Yi. The constable frowned and scolded. Bastard, your eyes are on your buttocks. Can't you see that the constables are handling a case? Get out of the way. Can you bear the responsibility if you make a mistake? As soon as he finished speaking, he felt something hard pressed against his waist. Are your dog eyes blind? Then a soft and feminine voice reached his ears. For them, working for the Yamen, no matter if it was a man's or a woman's voice, they had nothing to fear. But this kind of voice that was neither male nor female was the most terrifying. If they heard this kind of voice on the street, it meant that there was some important person in the palace here. And no matter who it was in the palace, it was not someone they, including their prefectural magistrate, could afford to offend. The constable shivered and immediately said, Forgive me, forgive me. We are only following the imperial edict to arrest a criminal of the imperial court. We didn't mean to alarm. The person in the dark did not speak again. The constable felt the hard thing on his waist disappear, and sighed in relief. When he raised his head again, there was only a vast stream of people. A person behind him asked, "Boss, what do we do now?" He pointed to another path with some annoyance and said, "Go around there." A criminal of the imperial court? Li Yi frowned. The flow of people in the capital during the night was the highest of the year, and it was also the time when trouble was most likely to occur. Sung Shichen was muddle-headed. He actually chose this time to arrest a criminal of the imperial court? However, with Rui and Mississippi Lu, as well as so many guards in the dark, there was no need to worry about the safety of the arrogant girl and the others. He was only puzzled for a moment before he was pulled to the side by the arrogant girl to look at a unique goldfish lantern. On the other side of the street, Xiao Chui hugged Zheng Zimo's arm and begged, "Miss, you are the best at guessing lanterns. Please guess another one." Zheng Zimo looked at the different lanterns hanging on her arms and said grumpily, "You already have so many. Sister Ruoqing guessed 2 for you just now. Can you still carry them?" Xiao Chui looked down and then handed 2 lanterns to Xiao Zhu behind her. She turned around and said with a smile, "Now I can carry them." Zheng Zimo gently pulled her ear and said, "Let's talk about it when we go back. How can we stroll around with so many lanterns in our hands?" "Oh." The servant girl lowered her head in disappointment and said softly. Then she seemed to have thought of something. She raised her head and said excitedly, "Miss, do you think we can meet Li tonight?" Zheng Zimo knocked on her head and said, "The capital is so big. How can you meet him just because you say so?" "Don't dream," the servant girl pouted. "But sometimes fate is so wonderful. Although the capital is big, as long as 2 people's hearts are the same. Oh miss, if you hit Xiao Chui again she will become stupid." Miaoing Pavilion. On the night of the first month, this kind of entertainment place had the most business. The beautiful woman had been shuttling upstairs and downstairs, entertaining all kinds of guests. Seeing someone walk in from the door, she immediately went up and said with a smile, "Oh young Master Chu, you are finally here. Shuang Shuang has been waiting for you tonight." She has already pushed away more than a dozen waves of people. Chu Ping was at a loss and said in disbelief, "Ah, Shuang Shuang has been waiting for me up there?" "That's right." The beautiful woman smiled and said, "For the past few days, Shuang Shuang has been talking about how she is indebted to young master for saving her last time, but she is unable to repay you. She feels really guilty." Chu Ping was a little embarrassed and quickly waved his hand. "It was nothing. I believe that anyone with a bit of righteousness in their heart would not just stand by and watch." Seeing this, Cui Shixin shook his head slightly and pulled his sleeve. "Come here." Chu Ping was pulled to a corner and asked in confusion, "What?" "I said you are a bookworm, but you are not convinced." Cui Shixin looked at him and said helplessly, "Can't you see that Lady Shuang Shuang has fallen for you?" "Ah." Chu Ping was shocked. "Think about it. What is your identity? You are the eldest son of the Chu family, a man of striking appearance and great literary talent. What is her identity? She is just an entertainer. That day when she was bullied, who was the one who stood up for her? At that time, she was at her weakest and most helpless. It was you who gave her hope and light. For a woman to fall in love with you because of this, isn't that very normal?" Cui Shixin looked at him and slowly said, "Lady Shuang Shuang has never accepted a private invitation from anyone before. Why is it that she spends time alone with you every day? Do you think it's just because you saved her?" "You mean?" Chu Ping looked at him in a daze and muttered, "Lady Shuang Shuang, she likes me?" Cui Shixin patted his shoulder and said, "Hurry up and go up. Don't let Lady Shuang Shuang wait for too long. Brother, I can only help you this much." Chu Ping stood there in a daze for a long time, before a happy expression gradually appeared on his face. He looked at Cui Shixin and said gratefully, "Thank you for your advice, Cui Shixin. I will go up now." Seeing Chu Ping quickly walk up the stairs, Cui Shixin found a seat in the hall and sat down. He picked up a cup of green tea and gently swirled it. The corners of his mouth curled up as he softly murmured, "That lady's body seems a bit weak. With Chu Ping's hobbies, I wonder if she can bear it." Somewhere on the street, a few bailiffs were sitting in front of a tea stall. One of them looked towards the wonderful sound pavilion. After a long time he turned his head and asked, Boss, it's about time, right? The leading bailiff said in a low voice. Wait a little longer, it's not time yet. Chapter 868. The streets of the capital of Shangyuan were abnormally crowded. Although the surrounding guards had purposely created a relatively loose space in the middle, it was still very difficult to walk through. Yongning was too short, and could only see the backs of others. Li simply carried her up. The proud Lolita was already very tall. She had always felt that she was no longer a child like Yongning, but at this moment, she was a little envious of her. The streets were mostly filled with lanterns and acrobatics. However, after watching too many of them, it became boring. The performances in the brothels were much more exciting. The group of people walked about half the street and entered a brothel. The brothel was still crowded, but it was orderly. Li Yi and the two young ladies followed behind them. It didn't matter which venue they entered. These performances in the brothel were nothing strange to him. However, this spacious hall seemed a little different. Looking over on one side, there were young scholars gathered in groups of 3 to 5, whispering to each other. On the other side, there were curtains. There were light voices coming from inside, and he could vaguely see the women behind the curtains. In between these young men and women, there was a long line of lanterns that separated them. On the other side, there were some young people holding lanterns and writing something on them. The proud Lolita asked doubtfully, Sir, what are you doing? Li Yi also didn't know who thought of this new way of playing. He waved to a worker in the brothel and asked, What are you doing? The worker only felt that the young man in front of him looked familiar. After recalling, he shivered and hurriedly said, Greetings, young master. I'll call the manager over immediately. Li Yi waved his hand and said, There's no need. I'm just taking a look. What are they doing over there? The worker immediately replied, Those people on the left are all famous scholars in the capital. They write poems on the lanterns and hang them there. If the ladies behind the curtains take a fancy to them, they will send a servant to tie a sachet on the lanterns. Li finally understood that this was simply another form of matchmaking. Back in the day, he had experienced it himself. He had received countless scented sachets and love letters. If he did not remember wrongly, it was from an open-minded lady who had even stuffed a warm doo-doo into his arms. No wonder some of the scholars were in high spirits, while others looked unhappy. That was because some of the lanterns in the middle didn't have a single sachet on them, while others had a few hanging on them. Choosing a son-in-law wasn't rare in this era. If it was in the future, the lanterns would definitely not have poems but photos. Perhaps there would even be property certificates, car keys, and passbooks. Xiao Huan watched as a servant girl came out from behind the curtains and hung her lady's sachets on the lanterns. She thought it was very interesting. She grabbed onto Li Yi's arm and said excitedly, Young master, why don't you also write a poem and hang it up? There will definitely be more sachets than all of them. In her heart, the young master was the most talented person. Otherwise, why would he be called the #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom? If the young master put up a lantern there, it would definitely be the one with the most sachets. The arrogant Lolita wished for the world to be in chaos. She added fuel to the fire and said, That's right. Mister, why don't you write a poem and beat them all? It's best if you don't even give them a sachet. The two of them seemed to want to see such a scene. Their expressions were somewhat excited. They completely didn't notice that the scholars not far away had expressions of displeasure on their faces. Hee, since when did such an arrogant person appear in the capital? He won't even leave us a sachet. Who does he think he is? The #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom? Even the #1 scholar wouldn't dare to say such arrogant words. Some of the scholars not far away were feeling depressed. When they heard the words of the two young ladies, they felt ashamed and angry. However, they didn't want to argue with them. In a split second, the gazes on Li Yi increased. Li Yi knocked on the heads of the two of them and said, Write whatever you want to write. Writing a poem also requires inspiration. It's not something that can be written just because you want to. There's nothing to see here, let's go. Rui and Lin Wanru went to the venue next door. There weren't any performances there, but there was an exhibition of women's clothing. It was the most popular style of women's clothing in the capital this year. Li originally wanted to follow them, but the arrogant Lolita and Xiao Huan insisted on seeing who had the most sachets in the end. He could only accompany them there. What Xiao Huan wanted to see the most was the young master's poem. She rolled her eyes and walked over. She whispered, "Young master, you've written poems for Xiao Huan, for Miss, and for Miss Sung. You've written many poems for second Miss." Li looked at Mississippi Lu. Mississippi Lu also looked over. "Forget it." Li shook his head and said, "Other people's lanterns and sachets have other meanings. It's better if we don't disturb them." Mississippi Lu turned her head expressionlessly. In front of her, someone walked over. It was a scholar dressed in a scholarly robe. He looked rather refined. In his hand, he held a lantern that was obviously inscribed with words. He smiled and said, "Sorry to disturb you. I hope you don't take offense. It's just that when I saw you from afar, I was amazed and admired you. Suddenly, I was struck by inspiration and came up with a poem. This poem originated from you, so I wanted to give it to you." After this young scholar walked out from the crowd, a sigh came from behind the curtains. This young Master Zhou's literary talent was brilliant. He was very famous among the scholars in the capital. He was also a new imperial examination scholar. He was the best candidate for a son-in-law. There were already many people who had their eyes on him. But today, young Master Zhou actually gave the lantern with his poem inscribed on it to the young lady. This was the most direct expression of his feelings. What gift? Before Mississippi Lu could speak, Li walked straight in front of her. He said to young Master Zhou, "You're willing to give it to her, but others aren't willing to accept it." He looked at Mississippi Lu and asked, "Isn't that right, Rui?" Mississippi Lu glanced at him and asked, "Is that right?" Young Master Zhou saw this and was delighted. He looked at Li Yi and twitched the corner of his mouth. He said, "You're not this young lady. How do you know if she's happy or not? Why, if you can't give this lantern out, you won't allow others to give it out." The lanterns here were not just lanterns. If one wanted to give a lantern out, he must write his own poem on it. The scene of Li Yi's refusal made this young Master Zhou feel that this person was just not talented, and could not write a suitable poem. Of course, if he really tried to look impressive at his own cost and randomly wrote a poem, then what awaited him would be even greater humiliation. Li glanced at him indifferently. He had seen too many such clumsy provocations. He looked at Mississippi Lu and said, "Xiao Huan is right. I haven't given you any poem. If I give it to you now, we don't need his." Xiao Huan had already taken her favorite lantern with a smile. The proud Lolita grabbed a pen from the other side of the table. "If you want to give it or not, who cares?" Mississippi Lu said in disdain. Her eyes looked at him. Li Yi held the lantern with one hand and wrote on the blank space with the other. He quickly put down the pen and held the lantern with both hands. He passed it to Mississippi Lu and said, "Rui, this is for you." Young Master Zhou wanted to stretch his head out to look, but was pressed back by Li Yi. At this moment, a manager from the brothel walked over and asked carefully, "Young master, do you want to hang this lantern over?" "No need." Li Yi waved his hand. He looked at them and said, "There's nothing interesting here. Let's go. Let's hang it." Mississippi Lu looked down and suddenly passed the lantern in her hand over. Although she was literate, she didn't know anything about poetry. However, she also wanted to see if the poem he gave her was good or not. Was it good to give to someone else? Chapter 869. Let's not hang it up. Li looked at Mississippi Lu and said hesitantly. The manager had already explained the rules to him in detail. Once the lanterns were hung up, it meant that they had agreed to the rules. It was fine if there were no scented sachets, but if there was a lady who hung up her own scented sachet, the two of them would have to have dinner together. If there were more than one scented sachet, they would have to choose one. His house was already in a mess, and there were many unresolved issues. There was no point in flirting with other ladies. Mississippi Lu looked at him and shook her head. "It's all right. I have nothing better to do, so I'll just take a look." Before young Master Zhou could see what was written on the lantern, the manager of the brothel had already hung it up. He waved his hand to summon another waiter, and handed over the lantern in his hand, saying, "Hang this up as well." Then he looked at Li Yi. It was obvious that he wanted to compete with Li Yi. Someone copied the poems on the 2 lanterns and sent them to the curtains. As for the candidates, according to the rules, their poems would not be revealed before the final result was revealed. What a mystery. I want to see how many scented sachets he can get. Even though I don't like Zhou, but he's just a nobody. He's overestimating himself. Every poem was recorded and sent into the curtains. Those who had yet to receive a scented sachet had already lost their chance. Those who had already received scented sachets, no matter how many of them there were, would not be embarrassed tonight. They were all waiting to watch the show. Of course, compared to this arrogant person who popped in halfway, they were still biased towards young Master Zhou from the bottom of their hearts. With the curtains blocking their view, they could only see the gist of it. However, they noticed that after the 2 poems were sent into the curtains, there was a commotion inside. Someone turned to look at young Master Zhou and clasped his hands, saying, "Looks like Brother Zhou really got a good piece of work today. It was just luck." Young Master Zhou was confident in his poems, but he still replied humbly. His actions allowed the crowd to understand that the man surnamed Zhou was truly going to shine brightly today. Very quickly, someone walked out from behind the curtains. It was a maid with a bun on her head. "That's from the Su family?" Someone recognized him at a glance. Another person said with a smile, "Miss Su has admired Brother Zhou for a long time. I'm afraid she's waiting for you to hang up her lamp today." "That is because Miss Su thinks highly of me." Young Master Zhou smiled lightly and said, "Miss Su is extremely talented. Actually, I also have some admiration for Miss Su." As soon as he finished speaking, a maidservant with her hair combed into a bun hung a fragrant sachet under a goldfish lantern. "Sir, there's one." The Tsundere Lolita shouted excitedly. She had just bought this goldfish with her husband. Mississippi Lu looked at him and then looked away. Young Master Zhou's expression was a little awkward. He coughed twice and covered it up very well. He said, "Hee, it seems that I have underestimated the people of the world." Someone comforted him. "Sigh, Brother Zhou, don't be discouraged. It's only one. Didn't Miss Su also fall in love with you? Look, isn't that girl from the Su family coming out? Miss Su is talented and beautiful. We also had a deep conversation." Young Master Zhou looked at the maidservant in emerald green clothes hanging the fragrant sachet under the goldfish and murmured, "Deep, deep conversation. Too. The Tsundere Lolita and Xiaohuan hugged each other and shouted, What kind of poem did he write?" Someone was stunned for a moment before revealing an extremely curious expression on his face. That Brother Zhou, perhaps these 2 times were just accidents. Someone stared at the curtain and said, "Look, another person came out." She walked to the side. She didn't choose that goldfish. That's strange. Why isn't she holding the fragrant sachet in her hands? Everyone's eyes widened as they watched a maidservant walk out from the curtain empty-handed. She walked past that goldfish, walked past young Master Zhou's lantern, and came to the front of a lotus lantern. "It's Brother Fong. Congratulations, Brother Fong." Although this lotus lantern had been displayed long ago, it was a little strange to hang the fragrant sachet only now. However, as long as it wasn't that weird goldfish, it was fine. Everyone cupped their hands towards a young man in the crowd. That young man smiled and cupped his hands in return. "Thank you for letting me win." After a round of congratulations, they saw that the maiden walked to the front of the lotus lantern and took down the fragrant sachet under the lantern. Then, she took 2 steps back and hung the fragrant sachet under the goldfish again. This works too? How can this be?" That young man with the surname Fong's expression froze. Looking at the lotus lantern that once again became empty, his expression gradually became sluggish. As for that young Master Zhou, he stood on the spot in a daze. The expression on his face was already indescribable. More and more people walked out from behind the curtain. Very quickly, the area below the goldfish was filled with fragrant sachets. Although not everyone hung the fragrant sachet under the goldfish, compared to the surrounding people, there was no need to compare. Those maidservants were afraid that they would fall behind. They huddled and shoved each other. The situation was starting to get out of control. It was to the extent that even the curtain had been lifted a little, and countless gazes were focused in a certain direction. At the same time, whispers could be heard from behind the curtain. It's that young master. That young master is even more handsome than young Master Zhou. His poetry is also well written. Why haven't I seen it before? I wonder who he will choose today. Li only glanced in a certain direction, and felt as though he was standing naked outside. When Mississippi Lu looked over, Li said innocently, I already said that I'm not pretending this time, but you just wouldn't listen. As he spoke, he grabbed the excited Sundara Lolita and Yong Ning and quickly walked out. Seeing him leave as though he was escaping, Mississippi Lu looked at the crowd not far away and a smile appeared on her lips. It seemed like he really wasn't being perfunctory. More than 10 scholars surrounded an old man and urged, Duke Song, what kind of poem did he write? Can you please evaluate it? The area around the lantern was completely surrounded. The only piece of paper with the poem was in the hands of this old man. The old man who was addressed as Duke Song stroked his beard and looked at the piece of paper in his hands. After looking at it for a long time, he mumbled, I can't evaluate it. I can't evaluate it. If I do, it would be superfluous. He looked outside the door and sighed. He is indeed the #1 scholar of the Jing Kingdom. He lives up to his reputation. What? The #1 scholar of the Jing Kingdom? He is Li Yi? While the crowd was stunned, young Master Zhou's face was already flushed red. Not far away, there were exclamations. Where's the lantern? That lantern is gone. It was here just now. Look for it quickly. Don't trample it. The brothel manager looked at the mess in the hall and revealed a bitter smile. How was he going to clean up this mess? Outside the door, Li saw Mississippi Lu walking out with the lantern. He looked at her and asked, How is it? It's all right. Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, I've been searching for her in the crowd for thousands of times. But when I look back, she's still there, in the dim light. What does this mean? Who are you looking for? I'm not looking for anyone. Li shook his head and pointed at the flickering lights in front of him. He said, I wrote it blindly. Look, the lights are waning like a dream. The person you like walks out from the flickering lights, and the two of them stare at each other in a daze. What a beautiful scene. Mississippi Lu's gaze followed the direction of his finger. A few figures walked out from the dim light. Xiao Chui looked at the familiar figure in front of her. After a moment of shock, she waved her arms excitedly and shouted, Li, we're here. Chapter 870. Xiao Chui waved her hand and turned to look at Zheng Zimo. She said proudly, Miss, I was right, wasn't I? Fate is something that no one can say for sure. Li Yi also felt that this sort of thing like fate was really too wonderful for words. That person is really at the place where the lights are fading. Mississippi Lu stuffed the lantern into his arms and turned to enter the field that Rui and the others had just entered. Li Yi turned his head to take a look. In the end, he still walked towards the figures in front of him. He looked at the more than 10 lanterns hanging on Xiao Chui and Xiao Zhu and said in surprise, Why did you buy so many? Xiao Chui shook her head and said proudly, I didn't buy them. They were all won by Miss and Sister Ruoqing. Xiao Huan followed behind Li Yi and looked around. She suddenly didn't know what to do. Yong Ning ran in Zheng Zimo's direction excitedly. Apart from her brother and sister Bing Ning, she liked Sister Zimo the most. Goddess Luo Shui looked at him and asked in confusion, Is it just you guys? As soon as she said that, Rui and Lin Wanru had already walked out from the field on the side. Although Mississippi Lu also walked out, she stood far away. Goddess Luo Shui ignored him and quickly walked over. She bowed to Rui and said in a low voice, Greetings, sister. We are a family. There is no need to be so formal. Rui smiled and took her hand. I saw a few clothes inside just now. They are very suitable for you. Let's go in and have a look. Zheng Zimo nodded and said, I will listen to you. The two went in hand. Yongning also went in holding Zheng Zimo's hand. Xiao Huan and Xiao Chui followed closely behind. Ruoqing glanced at him, smiled, and went in as well. In an instant, on the street, there was only him and Lolita left. Lolita held his arm and said solemnly, Don't worry, sir. I will never leave you behind. Li rubbed her head. The arrogant lowly squinted her eyes, a satisfied look on her face. She suddenly opened her eyes and looked at Li Yi. She said seriously, I will never abandon you. Can you promise me that you will never abandon Shanning? Li Yi smiled and nodded. All right. Pinky promise. The Tsundere lowly stretched out her pinky. Pinky promise. Although it was just a child's words that could not be taken seriously, Li Yi's heart was full of gratification at this moment. He smiled and said, they can go shopping by themselves. Sir will take you to eat delicious food, only you. Okay. The proud Lolita widened her eyes and her face was filled with joy. Although Mr. had never written a poem for her, he only brought her to eat delicious food. He did not bring Yongning, Sister Zumo, Sister Rui, Sister Xiaohuan, or Royal Sister. In short, she was the only man in the world now. Mississippi Lu leaned against the wall and watched the two figures disappear into the crowd. She looked at the lights everywhere with a slightly dazed expression. Lin Wanru did not follow Rui and the others in. She stood on the other side a few feet away and looked at the lanterns hanging outside. There were poems written on those lanterns. She walked from the first row and stopped in front of each lantern for a short while. Of course, some of them took a longer time, and some of them she just glanced at. Until the last one. This time, she stayed for a full quarter of an hour. At a certain moment, she stood a little closer and murmured softly, searching for her thousands of times in the crowd. Suddenly looking back, that person is there in the dim light. This poem. What does it mean? Hearing the voice beside her, she turned her head and looked at Mississippi Lu. She smiled and said, although I don't know who wrote this poem and what kind of state of mind he had at that time, but from the literal meaning, it should be that the person who wrote this poem went through hardships just to find a person, but in the end, he realized that the person he was looking for was actually by his side all along. Mississippi Lu was stunned and asked, isn't it in the dim light? Lin Wanru shook her head and said, the dim light is just a reference. The main point of this poem is suddenly looking back. She looked at Mississippi Lu, who suddenly turned around and ran into the surging crowd. She stretched out her hand and said in surprise, Miss Rui. Her figure disappeared in the blink of an eye. Lin Wanru only put down her hand after a long time. She shook her head in confusion and turned around to look at the lantern again. Li Yi held the lantern in one hand and used the other to protect the proud lowly's swinging leg on his chest. This way she wouldn't fall off from his shoulder. The proud lowly held a small bag in her hand. There were all kinds of snacks in it. While eating, she didn't forget to stuff some into Li Yi's mouth from time to time. Surrounded by the crowd, there was a street performer performing the sword-swallowing technique. The proud lowly was watching happily, so Li Yi didn't tell her the secret behind it. Suddenly, someone grabbed one of his arms. Li Yi turned around and looked at Mississippi Lu in surprise. He asked, why are you here? Give me back my lantern. Mississippi Lu snatched the lantern from his hand. Then she decisively turned around and disappeared into the street again. Li Yi looked at the crowd on the street in surprise. She was the one who didn't want the lantern earlier, but now she was blaming him. However, when he thought about how it wasn't the first time she did this, he could only shake his head and sigh. Women's minds are not something you can guess. The proud lowly felt wronged and looked in the same direction as him. She said weakly, that's my lantern. Miss Shuang's zither skills are getting better and better. In the deepest private room on the second floor of the wonderful sound pavilion, Chu Ping stood up from the praying mat in the middle of the room. He looked at the curtain in front of him and said with a smile, that song just now has reached the realm of emotional harmony. It can stir up the emotions in the depths of one's heart. To be honest, I've only heard this kind of zither music from an old friend of Grandpa's. According to Grandpa, that person is already standing at the peak of the path of music. Miss Shuang is still so young. It's truly unbelievable. Behind the curtain, the young girl's hands were still on the zither. Perhaps it was because she had used up too much energy, but her face was pale and her forehead was covered in sweat. She didn't wipe away the sweat. Her eyes stared blankly in front of her, and didn't reply. After a long time she said, young Master Chu, come in. Ah, come in? Chu Ping was slightly startled. Normally, even if he stayed in the same room with Miss Shuangshuang, there would always be a curtain between them. This was the first time Miss Shuangshuang invited him in. A thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Could it be that Cui Xixin was right? He tidied up his clothes and said, "Then, I'll come in." Chu Ping slowly walked over and gently lifted the curtain. The young girl was sitting with her back facing him. In front of her was a zither. Miss Shuangshuang. He had just opened his mouth to speak when the young girl stood up. The clothes that were as thin as a cicada's wings slowly fell off her body, revealing her naked body. Chu Ping looked at her in a daze. "Aunt Shuangshuang, you." The young girl slowly turned around and faced him. She said softly, "Young master's great kindness, this little girl is unable to repay it. The only thing I can give young master is this pure body." Chu Ping clenched his fists and looked away with difficulty. He gritted his teeth and said, "If you only want to repay a debt of gratitude." The young girl's face suddenly revealed a flowery smile. She took a step forward and gently embraced Chu Ping. She murmured, "In Shuangshuang's heart, she also likes young master," he said in a low voice. "When it comes to this kind of thing, I'm a little different from others." The young girl raised her head and looked at him. She said emotionally, "Shuangshuang is willing to do anything for young master." Chu Ping's body suddenly trembled. A look of joy appeared on his face, and his breathing gradually became rapid. Chapter 871. The Wonderful Sound Pavilion. Cui Xixin raised his head to look upstairs. He didn't know when, but one of the doors upstairs had opened a crack. He drank the tea that had already turned cold in one gulp, and raised his head to look upstairs. He paced around the room a few times before impatiently walking to the door. Then he walked back inside. In front of a tea stall on the street. "Boss, I see it. Let's go." After a short exchange, a few bailiffs quickly stood up and pushed through the crowd. They loudly said, "We are here to arrest a criminal of the imperial court. Unauthorized personnel, get out of the way." The crowd moved aside, and the few of them arrived at the entrance of the Wonderful Sound Pavilion. The leading bailiff waved his hand and said, "Go in and search." They were enjoying the music when suddenly, a bailiff barged in. The guests in the pavilion were startled, and the musician stopped playing. When the beautiful woman saw the bailiff barge in, she hurriedly ran over and said in a panic, "Sir Bailiff, what's going on? We've always been doing proper business here." As she spoke, she stuffed an ingot of silver into the bailiff's hand. However, this tactic, which had always been successful, was useless at this moment. The constable raised his hand and pushed her away, coldly saying, "We are under orders to capture the imperial court's criminal. Someone told us that the criminal is being sheltered here. As for whether you are doing proper business here, we will know after a quick search." The beautiful woman was about to speak, but she was interrupted. "Stop talking nonsense." The leading bailiff glanced at her and said to the people behind him, "Search." The guests in the main hall were terrified and wanted to leave. But the main door was already blocked by the bailiffs. Naturally, they didn't dare to rush out and could only stand where they were, anxiously watching as the bailiffs went upstairs, kicked down the door and searched. They just didn't know how many of the people inside would be so frightened that they would be permanently ill for the rest of their lives. Cui Xixin poured himself a cup of hot tea, raised his head to look upstairs, and continued to drink his tea. For the past few decades, the Chu family had been like a holy land in the hearts of the scholars of the Jing kingdom. Grand Tutor Chu had students all over the world, and had taught 2 emperors. In the current imperial court, including the left and right ministers, countless ministers had to respectfully address him as Old Man Chu. Grand Tutor Chu, who had always kept himself clean, and was particularly strict with his descendants of the Chu family, probably did not want everyone in Jingdo to know that the eldest legitimate son of the Chu family was in a brothel, and had some kind of perverted hobby when it came to making love with women. Fortunately, the bailiffs who were searching for the imperial court's criminal were from the capital governor's manor, so the Cui family was able to exert some influence. Otherwise, this scandal, which was enough to affect the reputation of the Chu family, would have spread far and wide. Cui Xixin raised his head to take another look, then slowly stood up and walked upstairs. On the main street, passers-by saw the officials blocking the entrance of the wonderful sound pavilion. They stopped in their tracks and watched from afar. In the restaurant on the opposite side, a large man poured warm wine into a cup and handed it to a middle-aged man opposite him. "Fifth master, the wine is warmed." The middle-aged man raised his wine cup. The burly man was about to sit down opposite him when he saw that the burly man's hand was trembling nonstop. The wine in the cup spilled all over his sleeves, but he didn't seem to care at all. He raised his hand and brought the wine cup to his lips. At this moment, there was not a single drop of wine left in the cup. "Fifth master, what's wrong? Are you very cold?" The large man hurried over and saw that the window behind the middle-aged man was open. He immediately said, "I'll go close the window." He stood in front of the window and glanced down. "Strange, what are those people looking at down there? Don't close it." At this moment, the middle-aged man's gloomy voice seemed to come from his throat. "But if you don't close it, the wind outside will blow in." I said, "Don't close it." Okay, if you don't close it, then don't close it." The large man helplessly shook his head. He waved at the waiter beside him and said, "Bring a heater over, hurry, hurry." The middle-aged man raised the empty cup and drank a mouthful. When he put down the cup, his arm couldn't help but tremble. The cup knocked against the table and made a clear sound. This attracted the attention of the people at the neighboring table. The large man walked over and looked at him. He asked in fear, Fifth master, are you sick?" "I'm fine." The middle-aged man didn't raise his hand. He said in a deep voice, "Pour the wine." "But, pour the wine." The large man could only obey. He watched as the cup of wine was brought to his mouth. There was not a single drop left, but he still pretended to drink heartily. He shook his head and filled the empty cup again. "I've been ordered to search for the imperial court's criminal. Don't touch the people inside." One of the constables kicked open the door and saw two naked worms on the bed in the room. He shouted loudly. The man and woman on the bed had long been scared silly. Two bailiffs had already rushed in and roughly swept their eyes over them. Their gazes fiercely landed on the woman's body a few times, then looked at the man. They waved their hands with some disdain and said, "It's all right, you guys can continue." After walking out of the room, they looked at each other and walked straight to the innermost room. "I've been ordered to search for the imperial court's criminal. Don't touch the people inside." The leading bailiff kicked the door open. The other two bailiffs immediately rushed in and rushed to the bed behind the curtain. Behind the curtain, the man's heavy breathing suddenly stopped and turned into panic. Who are you people?" The leading bailiff looked at the man on the bed and was stunned for a moment. He immediately cupped his fists and said, My apologies. I didn't know young Master Chu was here and disturbed you. Please forgive us. We will leave immediately. He looked at the bed. Chu Ping's hand was still on the woman's neck. The woman's exposed body was also covered in green whip marks and candle tears. The constable sucked in a breath of cold air and looked at Chu Ping. He cupped his fists again and said, This, young Master Chu's preferences are really unique. Young Master Chu, don't worry. We didn't hear or see anything tonight. Please continue." He waved at the two people in the room and said, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and leave." When they reached the door, a figure came in from outside. Cui Shixin looked at them and his face darkened. He said angrily, "Who let you in?" The bailiff smiled apologetically. Before he could say what he had rehearsed beforehand, he suddenly heard a terrified voice from the bedside. Chu Ping fell from the bed. His face was pale and bloodless. He murmured, "This can't be real. This can't be real. Shuang, wake up. I didn't use any force just now. I really didn't use any force just now." The bailiff looked at this scene in astonishment. Before he could ask, one of the bailiffs looked at the naked woman lying on the bed. He slowly extended his hand and put it in front of her nose. He then turned his head and said in disbelief, Dead? What?" Cui Yanxin and the bailiff's expressions changed at the same time. In the restaurant, the burly man looked at the middle-aged man whose clothes were mostly wet. He shook the empty wine flask and said, "Fifth Lord, there's no more wine. Let's go back." The middle-aged man picked up the remaining wine in his cup and slowly spilled it on the floor. He supported himself on the table and stood up with some difficulty. He said in a hoarse voice, "Let's go back." "That person is the Qin clan's fifth lord?" Based on the way that man addressed him, it should be him. I heard that when this Qin clan's fifth lord was young, he was a famous person in the capital. However, because the Qin clan had Qin Yan, he usually kept a low profile. How did he become like this now? You don't know. AI, this matter is also a sin. Downstairs, the burly man walked out of the restaurant with the middle-aged man on his back. He looked at the crowd and asked, "Fifth Lord, do you want to stay and watch the show?" A light cough came from behind him, followed by a hoarse voice. "Let's go back." "You really don't want to watch?" The burly man asked doubtfully. "Let's go back." All right, let's go back." The burly man shook his head and sighed. He carried the middle-aged man on his back and disappeared into the crowd. Chapter 872. How is this possible? Cui Xixin's face was pale, and his expression was one of fear. Is she really dead? How did she die? The bailiff once again placed his hand under the woman's nose and carefully examined her neck. With great difficulty he said, "She was strangled to death by young Master Chu." Chu Ping sluggishly sat on the ground and continued to mutter to himself. It wasn't me. I told you that if she couldn't take it anymore, she could just pat the bed and I would stop." Chu Ping quickly, "Put on your clothes and come with us." Cui Xixin finally came back to his senses. He looked at Chu Ping and said anxiously. He then instructed the constable, "Go and open the window at the back. You two stand guard here. Don't let anyone in." Their original plan was to use the matter of Chu Ping visiting a prostitute to make the Chu family owe them a small favor. Who would have thought that a life would be lost? This favor was too great. Not only could the Chu family not bear it, they couldn't pay it back either. He looked at Chu Ping, who was still in a daze, and solemnly said, "Remember, the person who killed Lady Shuang was the criminal of the imperial court who jumped out of the window. When that villain wanted to hurt you, it was fortunate that the bailiffs from the capital governor's office arrived in time." Seeing that Chu Ping was still sitting there and muttering to himself, Cui Xixin fiercely slapped his face and angrily said, "Did you hear me clearly?" Chu Ping's mouth was overflowing with blood as he raised his head to look at him. His eyes gradually regained their clarity and he nodded. I heard it clearly." Cui Xixin walked out and closed the door. He said to the two bailiffs at the door, "Watch this place, no one is allowed to enter or leave." The beautiful woman walked over and worriedly asked, "Young Master Cui inside?" "Shut up." Cui Xixin coldly looked at her and said, "Have everyone go downstairs. I suspect that there is a criminal of the imperial court among them. If they are found, your wonderful sound pavilion will not be able to escape responsibility." The beautiful woman's face paled. Criminal of the imperial court? In the Cui clan, Cui Qingming sat in the main hall, leisurely drinking tea. When he saw Cui Xixin rushing in from outside, he stood up and frowned. "What's wrong? Did you not succeed? Didn't you already use 1,000 silver taels to bribe that girl?" Cui Xixin swallowed a mouthful of saliva and said with a trembling voice, "It's done." "Since it's done, why are you panicking?" But that woman was killed by Chu Ping." "What?" Cui Qingming suddenly stood up. The teacup fell to the ground with a clang and shattered. He looked at Cui Xixin and asked in disbelief, That woman is dead?" "Father, don't worry. For the time being, no more people know about this. I've already sent people to control that place." Cui Xixin looked at him and said anxiously, "Father, what should we do now?" If they were only acting in secret, a few lives were nothing to them. However, the problem was that today's matter was specially arranged by them. Those bailiffs had caused such a huge commotion, it was impossible for them to easily cover it up. "What about the capital governor's residence?" Cui Xixin immediately said, "I haven't sent anyone to inform them yet." "Send someone to tell Lord Sung to slow down his actions." "What about you, father?" "Get someone to prepare a carriage. I want to go to the Chu family immediately." In the Chu family, a middle-aged man looked at Cui Qingming and said, Brother Chui, why have you come to the Chu family so late at night? Father is already asleep. If there's anything, we can talk about it tomorrow. Chui Qingming took a deep breath and said, Brother Chu, time is of the essence. I don't have time to explain to you now. If there's any delay, nephew Chu Ping will probably be in big trouble. Upon hearing his son's name, the middle-aged man immediately asked, What big trouble? Chui Qingming said in a low voice, It concerns nephew Chu Ping's life, and even more so, the Chu family's reputation. The middle-aged man's expression changed drastically. He immediately said, Brother Chui, please sit here for a moment. I'll immediately invite father over. Chui Qingming didn't sit for long before he saw Grand Tutor Chu draped in a thick cloak and supported by someone. He hurriedly got up and said respectfully, Greetings, Lord Grand Tutor. The old man waved his hand and asked, Just what happened? Speak. Chui Qingming hesitated for a moment, then said, Tonight, Shi Xian and nephew Chu Ping went to the Fine Sound Pavilion to listen to music. A woman in the pavilion revealed her feelings to Chu Ping. It's hard for young people to be a little impatient. Coincidentally, the constables of the capital governor's residence were searching for a criminal of the imperial court, and they accidentally ran into the two of them having sex. The middle-aged man's expression relaxed slightly. If it was just this, it wouldn't be too serious. It was just a normal affair between a man and a woman, and it didn't count as visiting prostitutes. Even if it did, although it would damage the Chu family's reputation, it wouldn't be so serious that it would endanger their lives. The old man looked at him with a sharp gaze. You came here so late at night for this? Chui Qingming lowered his head and said in a low voice, When the constables of the capital governor's residence went in, that woman was dead. A terrified expression appeared on the middle-aged man's face. The old man's body trembled, and he couldn't even hold his crutch steadily. His beard trembled, and he struggled to stand. He repeatedly said, This animal, this animal. Chui Qingming looked up and asked, Shi Xian has already ordered people to temporarily suppress this matter. Now, the people of the capital governor's residence will most likely go over. Qingming came here in the middle of the night to ask Lord Grand Tutor how this matter should be handled. The old man trembled as he walked to a chair and sat down. After a long silence, he waved his hand dispiritedly and said, This old man is not the capital governor's residence. There is no need to ask me about this matter. A trace of anxiety appeared on the face of the middle-aged man beside him. He was about to speak when Chui Qingming suddenly said, The criminal of the imperial court that the capital governor's residence captured was truly deranged. He hid in the Fine Sound Pavilion and not only used cruel methods to kill that young lady, but he also wanted to harm nephew Chu Ping. Fortunately, the constables arrived in time. The old man didn't reply. He used the chair to support himself as he stood up with difficulty. His murky gaze rested on Chui Qingming for a long time before he waved his hand and said, This old man is tired. Qingming is truly sorry to disturb Grand Tutor. Grand Tutor, please do not worry. This matter will definitely not involve nephew Chu Ping. Chui Qingming said this and bowed. Grand Tutor, rest early. Qingming will return first. The old man used his crutch to walk out the door. He shook off the middle-aged man's support and said in a hoarse voice, When you return, have him kneel in the ancestral hall. The middle-aged man's expression was complicated as he slowly nodded. Fifth Master, I'm leaving. The large man looked at the middle-aged man who had already taken off his clothes and went to bed. After saying this, he slowly retreated. A woman wearing coarse clothing walked over with a warm stove in her hand. She said, The master is afraid of the cold, so I brought an extra stove in. The large man opened the door and said, I'll help you put it in. The woman smiled and shook her head. No need. Your hands and feet are clumsy and your footsteps are heavy. The master has just fallen asleep, and will be woken up by others. It's better if I go, you go rest. The large man rubbed his head in embarrassment. Then I'll go to sleep first. The woman nodded. After the large man left, she walked into the room and placed the stove on the ground beside the bed. She straightened her body and looked at the middle-aged man on the bed in the darkness. She sighed and said, You don't need to be sad. Shuang Er's body doesn't have many days left. Liana used to love her the most. To be able to do something for you before she goes to see Lian. She must be very happy. In the darkness, the middle-aged man lying on the bed suddenly opened his eyes. He clenched his fists and tore the bedsheets. A suppressed, beast-like roar came from his throat. There's a way, there must be another way. She doesn't need to do this, she doesn't need to do this. In the wonderful sound pavilion, a bailiff once again turned his head to look at the bed. A puzzled expression appeared on his face. He pushed the person next to him and whispered, "Look, isn't she smiling?" The bailiff turned his head to look, and saw that the woman was already dead. Sure enough, there was a faint smile on her face. He walked over and covered her body with the bedsheet. He let out a long sigh. She's also a pitiful person. Early in the morning, the large man pushed open the door and walked out. The cold wind blew against his face and made him shiver. He looked at the courtyard full of white in a daze and muttered, "Didn't it get warmer a few days ago? Why is it snowing again?" He returned to his room and wrapped himself with another layer of clothing. Then he walked out through the garden path and walked towards a courtyard. He stopped halfway. In the depths of the garden, a plum blossom tree had quietly bloomed. It immediately added a few more decorations to the vast expanse of white in the garden. In front of the plum blossom tree, a figure stood straight in the snowflakes that filled the sky. "Fifth Lord, you came out so early today. Why didn't you open an umbrella?" The large man walked over and carefully brushed away the snowflakes on the middle-aged man's shoulders and body. He saw that a thick layer of snow had also fallen on the middle-aged man's head. It was unknown how long he had been standing there. He gently swept away the snowflakes on the middle-aged man's hair. However, there were a few places where the snowflakes couldn't be swept away no matter what. The middle-aged man's movements became sluggish. He looked at the middle-aged man in a daze, and a shocked expression appeared on his face. Fifth Lord, you." The middle-aged man turned his head to look at him. He revealed a smile and said, "This person, if you don't pay attention, you will grow old." Chapter 873. Li Yi was woken up by the cold in the morning. Since a few days before the Lantern Festival, the weather had gradually turned warm. Even the quilt on his bed had been changed to a thin one. However, he couldn't stand the cold in the middle of the night. He curled up his body and didn't sleep well. He slept in a daze until dawn. Of course, the reason why he woke up was because the proud Lolita ran in and put her cold little hand into the quilt. He didn't know what she had just done, but her little hand was like an ice cube. After a shiver, he was no longer sleepy. "Sir, get up. The sun is shining on your butt." The proud Lolita was wearing a thick cotton-padded coat. She rolled around the bed like a bear. Li Yi wanted to sleep a little longer in the quilt, so he had to get up. He put on his coat and asked casually, "Why are you here so early today? Don't you need to pay your respects to your father?" The proud Lolita lay on the bed and shook her legs. She said with a sad face, "Father is sick. The imperial doctor said that father needs to rest well these days. I came over after seeing him outside." These days, the old emperor's illness had become more and more serious. Li Yi was a little worried. He only hoped that the winter would pass quickly, and that the worst situation would not happen now. Hearing the noise and laughter coming from outside, he wondered, "What's going on outside?" The proud Lolita curled her lips and said, "They are having a snowball fight. Sister Xiaohuan is already 17 years old, but she is still so childish. I have long stopped playing that kind of game." Li Yi was stunned and asked, "It's snowing?" The proud Lolita nodded and said, "It started last night. It's very, very heavy. Sir, hurry up and get up. Let's go outside and make a snowman. Make the biggest one and make it bigger than theirs." The sudden heavy snow fell silently. Compared to previous years, there was not much snow this winter. However, it still snowed after the Upper Lantern Festival. This was something that had never happened in recent years. Of course, the night of the Upper Lantern Festival did not only have heavy snow, but also poetry. Searching for her thousands of times in the crowd. But when I look back, that person is standing in the dim light. This poem only took half a night to spread among the circle of scholars in the capital. The #1 scholar of the Jing Kingdom, whose poems had not been circulated for a long time, was so extravagant. This once again cemented his position in the hearts of those who loved poetry. This was not the only incident that caused a stir in the capital last night. There was a vicious court criminal who, while hiding from the bailiffs, hid in a music hall in the capital. After being discovered, in his anger and humiliation, he killed a musician in the music hall and escaped through the window. Now his wanted poster had been posted all over the streets and alleys of the capital, as well as all the city gates. Furthermore, because that scoundrel had almost injured the young master of the Chu family, the capital governor's manor had already strictly ordered the yamen in the capital region to investigate the whereabouts of that criminal, and offered a large reward. This made it so that if the people of Jingdo saw an unidentified outsider outside, they would all secretly pay more attention. The capital yamen. After an old man washed his hands in a copper basin, he respectfully said, "Sir, we have already investigated. This woman died because she suffocated. The 2 strangulation marks on her neck are the cause of her death." Sung Shichen's face darkened. Has the identity of this woman been investigated? A bailiff came forward and said, "Sir, we have already asked the people in the wonderful sound pavilion. That woman was a musician in the pavilion and had a bit of fame. She did not go to the wonderful sound pavilion every day. As for the situation of her family, we are still not clear. We have already sent more people to investigate." The old man hesitated for a moment, and then opened his mouth. "Sir, according to my examination, this woman was actually already infected with a serious illness and did not have much time left. Even if this did not happen, I'm afraid she would not live for more than half a year." Sung Shichen sighed and said, "Even if she was already beyond cure and did not have much time left, half a year is still 180 days, 2,160 hours. This is still a case of murder." Someone finally stood up behind Sung Shichen. Cui Qingming looked at the few people in the hall and said, "You may leave first." When the coroner and the bailiffs heard this, they immediately bowed and retreated. Cui Qingming looked at Sung Shichen and said slowly, "This matter involves the Chu family. The royal tutor has already tacitly agreed to it, so there is no need to complicate matters. Furthermore, that woman does not have much time left. Sir Tseng should know what to do, right?" "Of course I know the severity of the matter." Sung Shichen waved his hand. "I will order people to quickly search for that criminal. Don't worry." Cui Qingming smiled. "Then I can rest assured." Sung Shichen looked at him and asked, "Are you sure that this matter alone will make the Chu family wholeheartedly help us?" "Don't worry, the royal tutor is a smart man. If this matter is exposed, the Chu family's reputation will suffer a severe blow. The royal tutor may not care about himself or Chu Ping, but he will definitely not ignore the reputation that the Chu family has painstakingly built up bit by bit." Cui Qingming smiled again. "If that's the case, that woman's death is not completely useless. His Highness, the King of Shu, is still more important." Sung Shichen nodded and clenched his fists tightly in his sleeves. He looked at him calmly and said, "Since that's the case, leave the matters here to me. I believe in Sir Tseng." Cui Qingming cupped his hands at him and said, "I have to personally give a reply to the Chu family. I will take my leave first." "Take care." After sending off Cui Qingming, Chen Chong, who had been drinking tea to the side, stood up and said, "If this is all we have, we won't be able to touch the Chu family." Sung Shichen shook his head. "It's not that we can't touch them, but that the time is not right." "The time is not right?" Chen Chong was taken aback. Then he looked at him and narrowed his eyes. "Do you know what you will do when the time comes? You must give up something to gain." Sung Shichen looked at him and slowly said, "If you want to obtain something, you must first give up something. Be ****, you be ****. My Chu family has been of noble character and unquestionable integrity for generations. How did we produce a be **** like you?" Chu Ping knelt on the ground. In front of him were the memorial tablets of the Chu family's ancestors. Grand Tutor Chu raised the cane in his hand and struck it repeatedly on his back. The clothes on his back were already in tatters, and his back was a bloody mess. Grand Tutor Chu's breathing was ragged. A middle-aged man hurriedly patted him on the back and said, "Father, father, don't be agitated." Grand Tutor Chu shook off his hand and looked at him. He said angrily, "You taught your son well." His son had always been traveling with his father, and he had never taught him anything. Although the middle-aged man felt wronged, he did not dare to say anything. Chu Ping knelt there and wailed, "It's all my fault. I've disgraced the Chu family's ancestors. Grandfather, just beat me to death." "Beat you to death? What's the use of beating you to death? Will that woman come back to life if I beat you to death?" Although the old man said this, the cane that he had raised did not come down again. He panted slightly and glanced at Chu Ping. A trace of loneliness appeared on his face. As he turned to leave, he said, "Let the ancestors of the Chu family watch. Let him kneel here for 3 days." Chu Ping lay on the ground, his body trembling. He loudly said, "Thank you, grandfather, thank you, grandfather." Chapter 874. Qin Family. After the family banquet, Qin Xiang looked at his eldest son and said, "The reform mentioned this morning is related to agriculture. If you are not careful, it will shake the foundation of the country. You must be very careful with every step you take. You must not be careless." Qin Yan immediately nodded. "Father, don't worry. I will be extra careful. However, since it is a reform, you don't need to be too conservative. Don't be too careful." Qin Yan respectfully said, "I understand." After the conversation, Qin Xiang stood up and walked out of the room. Halfway through, he realized that he had left a dossier he had read before the meal on the chair. He turned back, and when he stepped through the door again, he was slightly startled. There was only one person left in the hall. That person was a bit thin. He stood up from the corner of the banquet table and placed the leftovers in front of him. Before he sat down, he saw Qin Xiang standing at the door. "Father." He looked at Qin Xiang and was surprised. Seeing him looking at him, he looked down and smiled. "There is still a lot of food left. If I don't eat, it will be a waste." Qin Xiang looked at his youngest son and was startled. There were strands of white hair on his head. When he smiled, there were wrinkles on his face. He was the youngest of the 5 Qin brothers, but he looked much older than his eldest brother. The old man realized that he had not paid attention to his son for a long time. "Those dishes are already cold. If you're not full, just ask the kitchen to make another serving." Qin Xiang brought the file over. When he walked out, he paused and said, "Don't eat too much at night. Rest early and be careful of your body." Qin he nodded. "Father." Qin Xiang heard the voice and turned around. Qin he looked at him and said with a smile, "The court is in turmoil. Although father is in a high position, you still have to be careful." Qin Xiang frowned and said, "Recently the court has been unprecedentedly stable. How can there be turmoil? Don't believe the rumors outside." Qin he listened respectfully. After he finished, he nodded and said, "Thank you, father, for the reminder. I understand." Qin Xiang took another deep look at him, then turned around and left. Fifth young master Qin looked at the leftover soup in front of him. The clear soup reflected his image. He stroked a strand of white hair on his head and stared at the soup in a daze. On the night of the Lantern Festival, it snowed all night. Although the snowfall gradually subsided, it still did not clear up. It was still early in the morning. On the streets of the capital, other than a few shops that had their doors half closed, most of the shops that faced the streets were tightly shut. A woman with her hair wrapped up and wearing only a thin shirt stood in front of a small building and knocked for a long time. When a beautiful woman inside opened the door, she rubbed her face that was red from the cold and smiled. "My sister is a musician in this building. She came to perform on the day of the Lantern Festival and hasn't been back for 2 days. Can I trouble you to call her? She's not in good health and has to take medicine every day." The beautiful woman rubbed her sleepy eyes and yawned. She asked in a muffled voice, "What's your sister's name?" The woman smiled and said, "Her name is Shuang Shuang." "Sir, what are they doing?" The proud Lolita lifted the curtain of the carriage window and saw a group of people gathered at the foot of the city wall. She turned her head and asked Li Yi, "They're probably looking at the court's criminal." As the carriage drove over, Li Yi also heard the discussion of some people on the street. It seemed that yesterday, a criminal wanted by the court committed a murder case in the capital. Using the chaos of the Upper Yuan dynasty, he successfully escaped. This made the higher-ups very angry. They did not hesitate to issue a large warrant for his arrest. The bounty was even more generous. They paid a great price to capture this person and bring him to justice. The capital was under the feet of the emperor, and the criminal was a criminal wanted by the court. Coincidentally, it was the Lantern Festival. It was no wonder that the higher-ups had such a big reaction. However, with the warrant being issued, unless the criminal had the ability to change his appearance, it would not be easy for him to escape near the capital. It must be known that around Jingdo, there was a group of madmen who wanted to farm points to raise their ranking. How could they let go of such a good opportunity? In principle, for a criminal wanted by the court with great fanfare to appear in Jingdo and commit another crime was an inconceivable thing. However, there was always an oversight. At this moment, the matter of the criminal was not important to him. The old emperor's health was more important. This snow had come suddenly, and the old emperor's illness had also worsened suddenly. From the beginning, Li Yi knew that there was no possibility of his illness recovering. Sometimes it was all about luck. Even though he had already let go of court affairs and focused on recuperating, no one knew when bad luck would arrive. Li Yi's mood was a bit depressed. Some things could be solved perfectly, and some things could not. Faced with this matter, even he felt a deep sense of helplessness from the bottom of his heart. The carriage suddenly came to a stop. The proud Lolita lost her balance and fell on top of him. A red cloud appeared on her face. In a small voice she said, "Sir, I didn't do it on purpose." Li Yi supported her waist and helped her sit properly. The angry scolding of a palace guard could already be heard from outside. "How do you walk? Don't you have eyes?" After scolding, the guard knocked on the carriage in a panic and asked, "Your Highness, are you all right?" "I'm fine," the proud Lolita replied in a small voice. She then asked, "What happened outside?" The guard immediately said, "A woman suddenly walked out of the alley and almost ran into her. I had no choice but to rein in the horse and disturb your Highness. Please forgive me, your Highness." The proud Lolita asked in a quiet voice, "She didn't hurt anyone, did she?" A guard had already helped the woman who had fallen to the ground up. He furrowed his brows and asked, "Are you all right?" The woman didn't look at him. Her eyes were unfocused as she walked forward in a daze. Strange person. The guard glanced at her and turned his head. "Your Highness, she didn't hurt anyone. Let's keep going." Li Yi lifted the curtain to take a look, only to see a distant silhouette. He shook his head and lowered the curtain again. After visiting the old emperor, the dark clouds in Li Yi's heart dissipated a little when he walked out of the hall. Naturally, it was because his illness wasn't as serious as he had expected. It was probably because of the sudden drop in temperature that he was having a relapse. A eunuch led him to the side hall and said that the heir and the eldest princess were already waiting there. When Li Yi and the proud Lolita walked in, they found that they weren't the only ones in the side hall. Princess Ning was holding Mingzhu's hand and talking. Li Xian was playing chess with Ning Wang. Seeing them enter, Princess Ning waved at the proud Lolita. "Shaning, come quickly, come here." Li Yi bowed slightly and said, "Greetings to Ning Wang and Princess Ning." Every year at the beginning of the year, the nobles from all over would enter the capital. Because Li Xian was in the capital, Ning Wang's family would often stay for a few more days. "Dr. Li, no need to be so courteous." Ning Wang waved his hand and looked at him. He shook his head and said, "In terms of the ability to judge people, I really am not as good as my royal brother. Dr. Li is an outstanding person. I actually misjudged you back then." Chapter 875. You flatter me, your Highness. Li Yi cupped his hands in greeting politely. He did not appear overly intimate, nor did he appear overly distant. His friendship with Li Xian was limited to the two of them. He once had some connection with Ning Wangfu, but that was a long time ago. "You've been in the capital for so long, and you even have a child, but your chess skills haven't improved at all." Ning Wang picked up a black piece and put it down. He looked at Li Xian and shook his head. Li Xian smiled awkwardly and said, "Father's chess skills are superb. I am ashamed." Ningguang looked up at Li Yi and suddenly said, "I wonder if Dr. Li is interested in playing a game with I?" "To tell you the truth." Li Yi looked at Ningguang and shook his head. "I am not proficient in Go." He was speaking the truth. He had never played Go in his previous life. Although the rules and playing methods could be easily learned, he couldn't learn the experience. Otherwise he wouldn't have to play with the proud lowly and release the Dumbo, the earth-drilling mouse, and the celestial dog. With his current level of Go, he could only fool ordinary people. He was far from a master of Go. Li Xian had already given up his seat. He said, "You are the #1 talent of the Jing Kingdom. Don't be humble. It would be best if you could win a few games against father, and help me save some face." Li Xian stood up. Ningguang was sitting across from him and looking at him. It would be too awkward to refuse again. Li Yi could only nod and sit across from Ningguang. "Sir, you are playing Go with uncle." The proud lowly ran over from the side and sat next to Li Yi. She propped up her chin with her hands and poked her head out to watch the game. Princess Ning and Emingzu also walked over. Ningguang looked up at Li Emingzu and said, "These days, thanks to you, brother can recuperate in peace. If it were anyone else, he wouldn't be able to relax in the affairs of the court." Princess Ning held her hand and said worriedly, "Look, it has only been a year. You are so thin now." Li didn't quite understand Princess Ning's words. She drank soup every day, and he even added some special ingredients to the soup. How was she skinny? Martial artists like her had well-proportioned bodies and didn't have any excess fat on their bodies. From head to toe, there were parts of her body that were fatter than a year ago. It was impossible for her to be skinny. "It is indeed inappropriate to let you decide the affairs of the country alone." Prince Ning put down a piece and said, "The efficiency in the 3 provinces is low, and there are many useless people. Outside the 3 provinces, you should make an exception and find some talented and virtuous people to help you deal with those trivial matters. You." After he said, he looked at Yi and said, "Dr. Li is really not good at Go." Before Li Yi could speak, the proud lowly wrinkled her nose and said, "Uncle, I will play for you." Ningguang smiled and said, "Since when does our Shaning know how to play Go? I will not play with you. If your father knows, he will say that I am bullying the young." The proud lowly put a piece on the board and said discontentedly, "Uncle, don't look down on me. I am very good at Go." Good. Shaning is the best." Seeing that Li Yi didn't mind, Prince Ning didn't say much. He played with her hand, but his moves were not as sharp as before and became casual. Princess Ning continued the conversation and looked at Emingzu. She said, "Your uncle is right. You still need to find someone to help you in the affairs of the country. The capital governor is good. The people from the Shen family are said to be very capable. Prime Minister Qin is old now, but there are still a few people from the Qin family in the court. Like father, like son. In short, it is not so easy to take over the government affairs. Don't tire yourself out." Dong Wenyun is indeed very capable. Although the one from the Shen family is not as good as him, he is also not bad. As for the Qin family, except for Prime Minister Qin, there is no one capable. Prince Ning shook his head. He seemed to think of something and said, "Qin He of the Qin family, what is his position in the court now?" "Qin He?" A glimmer of confusion appeared in Mingzhu's eyes. In the second generation of the Qin family, other than Qin Yan, there were 2 other people who were officials in the court. She had never heard of this Qin He. Li Yi, who was watching the proud lowly play Go, said, "Qin He, the 5th son of Prime Minister Qin. He has always been idle at home and has no official position. That is a bit strange." Prince Ning shook his head and stopped thinking about these things. He continued to talk about the matters of the court with the eldest princess. Li Yi had always thought that this Prince Ning, who was far away from the capital, was just an idle prince. However, when he talked about these matters, it was as if he had been in the court for a long time. It was truly surprising. Qin He, the 5th master of the Qin family. He had just said that the Qin family had no one capable, but he had singled out Qin He. What was so special about this 5th master of the Qin family? From Wu Er's side, there would often be news of the Qin family. More or less, the name of the fifth master of the Qin family would appear. However, the general description was the same as the rumors in the outside world. This fifth master of the Qin family did not have much of a position in the Qin family. He could even bully the younger generation of the Qin family as he pleased. As a result, he had always been in a state of self-abandonment. However, sometimes he would do some strange things. The proud lowly saw that his mood was not too high and thought that he was upset because he couldn't beat Imperial Uncle Ning Wang. She patted her little chest and said, "Sir, don't worry, we are about to win." Prince Ning, who was talking to Emingzu, turned his head and couldn't resist smiling. Although little Shaoning knew how to play Go, which was somewhat unexpected, her skill level was not high. He only needed to casually deal with it. This Dr. Li was a friend of Emingzu and Xian. Naturally, he couldn't let him lose too badly. However, this game of Go had reached this point, so there was no need to continue. He smiled and picked up a chess piece. Just as he was about to put it on a certain position, his arm sank halfway. After a slight pause, he could no longer smile. The proud lowly raised Li Yi's palm and reached out her little hand to give it a pat. She said with a smile, "Sir, we won." The princesses of the royal family were not easy to deal with. Don't compete with Emingzu, don't play Go with Shaoning. This was an iron rule. Prince Ning lost a game of Go. He was surprised by the proud lowly's Go skills and proposed another game. Of course, the proud lowly would not refuse. After all, Prince Ning had been immersed in Go for many years. No matter how talented the proud lowly was, she was only 14 years old. After a fierce fight, she gradually fell into a disadvantage. Of course, the one who lost in the end was still Prince Ning. Turning defeat into victory and reversing the situation was the proud lowly's specialty. Especially after she used the flying chess, the invisible chess, and the ultimate move of eating up the small chess pieces. Prince Ning lost without any suspense. The old emperor's illness was not as serious as he had imagined, which made him feel a little relieved. On his way home, sitting in the carriage, he inadvertently glanced out through the gap of the curtain, only to find that Feng seemed to have a lot on his mind. Before he could ask, Feng opened the curtain a little and asked, "Young master, I have a question to ask you." Li Yi sat up straight. The first thing he thought about was whether he had encountered anything recently, so that he wouldn't be hurt by his words. After finding that he probably hadn't, he looked at him and said, "What's the matter? Say it." Feng looked at him and hesitated for a long time before he said, "I want to take little Hong home. What do you think will happen?" "I think you will die." Li Yi looked at him and said without any hesitation. He was well aware of his sister-in-law's temperament. She had bought a large mansion in the capital city, and all the servants in the house were men. Not to mention young and beautiful maidservants. There wasn't even an old lady with yellow pearls. Forget about bringing Xiao Hong back. If she knew what Lao Feng had been secretly doing for the past 2 years, Lao Feng wouldn't be sitting in the carriage and asking him this question now. With his timid personality, how could he suddenly have such a suicidal idea? Li Yi thought for a moment, looked at him and asked suspiciously, "You didn't take the girl's body, and now you can't take it anymore, right?" "How could that be?" Feng waved his hands repeatedly. "Young master, even you don't dare to do this kind of thing. How could I?" "Really? Really?" Feng raised a hand. "I swear, if I say half a word of lie, let me be struck by lightning." "No sincerity." Li Yi shook his head and said, "It's winter, how could there be lightning?" Boom! As soon as he finished speaking, a thunderous sound suddenly exploded in his ears. Feng's whole body trembled. He looked up at the sky and found that there was no more sound. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "I really didn't do it, could it be that young master?" Boom! 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 The deafening sound came again, and it hurt people's eardrums. Chapter 876. The rumbling sound came suddenly. Feng turned over and rolled off the carriage. He looked at the sky vigilantly. After listening for a while, he realized that the sound did not come from the sky. He turned his head and saw that not far ahead, there was a woman beating the big drum in front of the yamen. What he heard just now was not thunder, but the drum. He breathed a sigh of relief and jumped back into the carriage. He said, "So someone is beating the court drum. I was scared to death." The court drum was a large drum erected in front of the yamen. It had two functions. One was for the county magistrate to beat the drum to gather the crowd when he went to court. The other was for the commoners who had been wronged to beat the drum to express their grievances. Li lifted the curtain and took a look. The woman who had beaten the drum had already been ushered in by the yamen runners. He did not pay much attention to her. He put down the curtain and looked at old Fong. "Are you serious about what you said just now? It's not a good way to go on like this." Fong sighed and said, "There has to be an end to this matter." Li hung the curtains to the side and asked curiously, "How did you and Lil Red meet?" Fong leaned against the carriage and looked at the sky. He smiled and said, "About a year before you came up the mountain." At first, Li thought that Fong was just a simple and honest man without many thoughts. Later, he found that his thoughts, especially when it came to feelings, were extremely delicate. Under his simple and honest appearance, there was a soul of coquettishness. He and Little Red got to know each other because of the old story of a bear saving the beauty. Later, they met in the jadeite courtyard by chance. As time went by, they became familiar with each other. They communicated with each other across the wall in the jadeite courtyard, and gradually developed to the point where they were today. According to Fong, it was not to the point. At present, the two of them only held hands in a pure relationship. The relationship between him and Mrs. Fong should be familial, and Little Red was probably Fong's love. As for how to make the two perfectly fuse, if he knew, he wouldn't have to run between them every day. His own affairs were still a mess, and he couldn't help much with Fong's family affairs. Li could only shake his head and say, "Let's think about this at length." "That's right, let's take our time to think about it." Fong nodded and said, "Miss Suemo has already succeeded. Second Miss Ruoqing, Princess Royal, Miss Lin, and even Xiaohuan hasn't married yet. I'm afraid that the little princess only has Xiaohuan in her heart. We need to think about them one by one." Li thought for a moment and said, "Well, I'll ask Rui to go over and talk to Mrs. Fong. Tell her that you want to bring another mistress back." As the first wife of the Fong family, she should be generous and not obstruct you. She will definitely listen to Rui. How about it? That's good enough, right? Fong waved his hand repeatedly. "Forget it. I can solve this kind of trivial matter myself. I don't want to trouble Miss." The carriage gradually went away. In the yamen, a constable sent the woman out, shook his head and said helplessly, "Miss, this case has been handled by the yamen from the beginning to the end. You can go there and ask." The woman's face was pale, but she still nodded and said, "Thank you, constable." The constable looked at her and said with pity, "Miss, let me remind you when you go to the yamen, don't knock the drum in front of the gate." Chu Ping Chui Xixin. Li crumpled the paper in his hand into a ball and threw it into the stove. Chui Xixin and the young master of the Chu family were also in the wonderful sound pavilion when the imperial court criminal committed the murder. It was said that they were almost implicated. This was also one of the reasons why the capital governor's office placed so much importance on this case. He had never underestimated the Chu family and had always sent people to keep an eye on them. However, this matter had been handled by the yamen from the beginning to the end. Sung Shichen hadn't sent any news, so there shouldn't be any problems. He warmed his hands by the fire, then picked up his brush and began to write on the rice paper spread out on the table. Mississippi Lu insisted that the Green Jade Case, Lantern Festival he had written on the lantern that day was too sloppy. There were many words in it that she didn't recognize, so it wasn't a suitable gift. She wanted him to write it again. It was normal that Mississippi Lu couldn't recognize it. She only knew a few words, and the situation that day was different. In order to speed things up, he had used a type of calligraphy that was between cursive and semi-cursive. Anyone with a bit of knowledge in calligraphy would be able to recognize it, but to an illiterate like her, it was naturally scribbled and couldn't be seen clearly. However, she was Mississippi Lu. If Second Miss wanted her to write it in regular script, she would write it in regular script. It wasn't a big deal. After Li Yi finished writing, she checked it and nodded in satisfaction. Li Yi reminded her, "Don't forget, you still owe me something." What is it? Asked Mississippi Lou with a frown. According to the rules of the Lantern Festival, the lantern and the sachet had to be exchanged in the end. Mississippi Lou took his lantern, so she naturally had to give him a sachet. This was the rule of the game. Since you took my lantern, you have to give me something. It's something that you women wear closely, reminded Lee again. Mississippi Lou frowned even more. What are you talking about? Lee pointed at her chest. You still haven't guessed it. That year in the Mid-Autumn Festival, in that garden, those women stuffed it into my arms. Mississippi Lou finally understood. The doo-doo that was stuffed into his arms was thrown away by her. She looked up at him and asked coldly, "Are you sure?" Lee looked at her expression and said in surprise, "It can't be. It's not something valuable. You can't even bear to give it to me. Why don't you return the lantern to me? I don't want that thing anymore. Come in, I'll give it to you." Mississippi Lou thought for a moment. She crossed her arms and walked into her room. She said, "Remember to close the door." It was just a sachet. Why did she have to be so mysterious and close the door? It was not like she was doing something shameful. Lee shook his head and followed her in, at the entrance of the Capital Magistrate's office. "How many times have I told you? No one has claimed the body. It has long been buried in a mass grave. As for where it was buried, how would I know in the dark?" A bailiff impatiently waved his hand and said, "The magistrate's office is already doing its best to capture the culprit. The wanted poster has already been sent out. As long as the culprit is still in the capital, he won't be able to escape even if he has wings. Don't worry. Once we have news of the culprit, we will immediately send someone to inform you." The woman said softly, "Even in the hot summer, an unclaimed body should be kept for at least 3 days. Moreover, it is winter now, so it should be at least 7 days later. It's the new year. The coroner has already examined the body. There is nothing suspicious about the case. We just need to wait for the culprit to be brought to justice. The yamen has nowhere to keep it for you. I've already told you what you need to know. I'm warning you, don't cause trouble here again. If you do, we won't be polite anymore." When the bailiff spoke again, his tone had become angry. The woman knelt in front of the yamen and said in a sorrowful voice, "I just want to know how my sister died." On the street, passers-by gradually gathered around and looked at the woman with puzzled gazes. They looked at the yamen's door and pointed at it. When did she have another sister? In the back hall of the yamen, Cui Qingming slammed his hand on the table and said angrily. Sung Shichen took a sip of tea and said unhurriedly, "Although this is unexpected and there are a few more variables, it may not be a bad thing. If even her family believes that the woman died at the hands of the culprit, then there will be no more changes to the case in the future. I'm just afraid that the changes will happen now." Cui Qingming narrowed his eyes and murmured. Hearing the murderous intent in Cui Qingming's words, Sung Shichen raised his head and glanced at him. He stood and said, "This woman must not be touched." Cui Qingming smiled and said, "Brother Tsung, there is no need to remind me. I know that if anything happens to this woman, it will attract the attention of people with ulterior motives." Sung Shichen nodded and said no more. The two of them discussed a few more things before Cui Qingming left the yamen through the back door. When he stepped onto the carriage, his body paused slightly, and he turned his head to look at a guard in front of the carriage. He stretched out his hand and lightly waved it in the air. Inside the yamen, at the dining table, a woman heard the rumbling outside and put down her bowl and chopsticks. She said with dissatisfaction, "What is going on outside? There is no end to it, is there?" A yamen runner came in from outside and said with a bitter face, "My lord, that woman did not listen to our advice at all. She has begun to beat the drum and complain about her grievances again." Sung Shichen put down his chopsticks and his face darkened. He said, "The capital yamen is not a place for her to behave atrociously. Guards, arrest that woman. Give her 20 strokes of the cane and temporarily put her in prison." The yamen runner was stunned and said with some uncertainty, "My lord, this punishment, isn't it a bit too heavy?" Sung Shichen waved his hand. "No matter. The prestige of the yamen is not to be provoked. Only a heavy punishment will serve as a warning." Just be careful when executing the punishment. The yamen runner said no more and bowed. This subordinate obeys. Chapter 877. At the entrance of the capital magistrate's office, the woman beating the drum was once again stopped by a bailiff. Many passers-by had stopped to watch from the side of the street. They pointed at the woman not far away and whispered to each other, "I saw her beating the drum here early in the morning. I wonder what kind of injustice she has suffered. I heard that it's because of her sister's death. I also heard the bailiff say that she's a criminal. I'm afraid it's not because of the case at the wonderful Sound Pavilion 2 days ago. That evil thief's wanted poster is posted all over the street. What's she doing here? Could it be that there's more to this case?" As the crowd discussed animatedly, a bailiff walked out from inside and looked at the woman. He waved his hand and said, "Take her down. This is the capital magistrate's office. Is this a place for you to mess around?" The bailiff looked at her indifferently and turned his head to say, "Sir has ordered that this woman has repeatedly challenged the magistrate's authority and obstructed official business. Take her in and give her 20 strokes." Then he walked forward and dispersed the crowd on the street. He loudly said, "There's nothing to see here. Disperse, disperse." Although the drum at the entrance of the yamen was used by the people to seek justice, it was not allowed to be beaten randomly and disrupt the yamen's normal order. However, even though there was such a rule, the woman had just lost a loved one. It was understandable that she was grieving. To punish her like this was somewhat unreasonable in the eyes of the crowd. However, this was not something they could discuss. They could only shake their heads and disperse as they watched the woman being taken in. "Boss, are we really going to give her 20 strokes?" A bailiff looked at the thin woman and said hesitantly, "What if she dies after 20 strokes? You pig brain." The bailiff fiercely knocked on the man's head and said angrily, "Sir has said to pay attention to propriety. If she dies, you'll pay with your life." The bailiff who was knocked on the head put on a long face and asked, "What propriety?" The bailiff waved his hand. "It's enough. After beating her, take her to jail and lock her up first. Don't let her come out and cause trouble again." A moment later, the constable came to the pale-faced woman who was pressed on the stool. The scene of the woman's death that night appeared in his mind, and a trace of pity appeared on his face. He shook his head slightly and waved his hand. "Give me the board, I'll do it myself." When the two bailiffs escorted the woman into the prison, they felt that today was an eye-opener. After working in the yamen for so long, this was the first time they saw someone who could walk to the prison on her own after being flogged. "I don't want it anymore. I don't want the sachet anymore. I don't want the lantern anymore. I don't want the poem anymore." Lee covered his butt and limped out of Mississippi Lou's room. He turned around and said, "Take it if you like it. What else do you like? Just take it, it's all yours." Mississippi Lou glanced at him and said faintly, "Who told you not to make it clear?" Lee didn't want to explain anymore. Wasn't it clear enough just now? She owed him. The thing that a woman wore close to her chest, and someone had given it to him before. Other than the sachet, what else was there? A belly band? She didn't even think about it. He was a dignified county marquis, a man of indomitable spirit. How could he be so perverted? Mississippi Lou looked at him again and said, "I owe you the sachet. I'll return it to you in the future." "Forget it, not in the future. I don't want it anymore." Lee rubbed his but that was still faintly aching. When did she develop this bad habit? Couldn't she find another place to start? "You have to take it even if you don't want it." After saying this, Mississippi Lou flipped her hair and left him a cool view of her back. Although she said it directly, it was already 2 months later that he received the sachet from Mississippi Lou. If it was a simple sachet, he could just buy one on the street. However, Mississippi Lou was so picky about his gift. She even asked him to make a new copy of the poem. Of course, she wouldn't be so careless with her gift. The cloth used for the sachet was carefully selected from her collection of cloth. She heard from Xiaohuan that second miss took a full 3 days to choose the spices, and then to embroider something on it, sewing the broken pieces of cloth together. In this period of time, she did not know how much was wasted. That was why it dragged until now. She was very good at fighting with others, but when it came to cooking or needlework, it would greatly lower the level of most women. Li held the sachet sewn by Mississippi Lu. He was very sure that if he wore it out, he would definitely be laughed at by others. However, looking at the eyes of Mississippi Lu, he could only ignore his conscience and nodded. Very good, I like it very much. Mississippi Lu's somewhat nervous expression finally eased. She said, "It's my first time sewing. There are many places that are not done well, just make do with it." Li nodded and said, "There are indeed many places that are not done well. For example, there are some marks in the stitching of the cloth. The color matching is not very good. The stitches are thin and dense. The choice of spices seems to be." Mississippi Lu looked at him calmly. "Also what?" Li hung the sachet on his waist with satisfaction and said, "It seems there is nothing to be picky about." No matter how ugly the sachet sewn by Mississippi Lu was, it was still unique in this world. He either insisted on this truth, or beat her and tell her what was wrong with the choice of spices and the matching. Today, Li did not have the time to fight with her for 300 rounds to correct her mistakes, because today was the day that Lin Wanru and Lin Yong set off to return to the Qi Kingdom. The caravan of merchants from the Qi Kingdom who came along with them had left the capital city long after the Lantern Festival. They had stayed for more than 2 months. If they did not return soon, the Lin family's business in the Qi Kingdom would most likely have an unforeseen event. He had discussed all the details of the cooperation with her a month ago. This time, he would also send a caravan of merchants and guards to escort them to the Qi Kingdom. The caravan arrived at the city gate. Rui and Lin Wanru were talking. Rui came down from the carriage and patted her hand, saying, "It's a long journey from here to the Qi Kingdom. Sister Lin, be careful on the way." Lin Wanru smiled and said, "Although it's a long journey, we've gone back and forth several times. With these guards escorting us all the way, you don't have to worry, sister." Then, she walked to Li Yi's side, looked at him, smiled and stretched out her hand, saying, "Goodbye." Li Yi was stunned. Then he also stretched out his hand, and the two of them shook hands. Lin Wanru turned her head, looked at Rui and explained, "This is a kind of etiquette in our hometown, called the handshake ceremony. It's used to greet friends who have not seen each other for a long time, or to bid farewell to friends who are about to be separated." Lin Yong looked at this scene in astonishment. After scratching his head, he also stretched out his hand to Li Yi, and said with a sad face, "Li brothers, goodbye." Li Yi punched him hard on the shoulder and said with a smile, "Why are you pulling a long face? It's not like you won't see each other. In less than half a year, I'm afraid you'll have to come back to the capital again." Lin Yong smiled honestly and said embarrassedly, "It's not that I can't bear to part with you, Li brothers." Li Yi smiled and said, "Two men, don't be so sentimental. I can't bear to part with the food cooked by Li brothers." After Lin Yong finished speaking, Li Yi was stunned. Then he waved his hand and said, "Let's go, let's go." He watched Lin Yong get into the carriage with a big smile, leaning against the carriage and waving at him. When Lin Wanru bent down to lift the curtain, she looked back and disappeared behind the thick curtain in the next moment. The convoy slowly drove out, and when the last carriage could not be seen, Li Yi turned his head and said, "Let's go back." "Mother." The city gate was crowded with people and it was noisy, but he and Rui both had extraordinary hearing. How could they not hear this childish and somewhat muffled voice? Rui looked down at the little fellow in the swaddling clothes, and a happy expression appeared on her face. She suddenly looked at Li Yi and asked, "Husband, did you hear that just now?" Although the 6-month-old child could not understand language yet, under the deliberate guidance of his mother, he was already able to spit out words one by one. Li Yi sighed and said, "As expected, my wife still won." Li Duan also seemed to feel Rui's joy. He curled up in the swaddling clothes and smiled. He opened his mouth again and made a vague sound. "Little mother." That you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.